In the late spring of 1841, on a bluff above the Kliazma River in central Russia, a Scottish geologist sat on his horse and looked at a wall of red and yellow clay he could not name. He had been riding for weeks. Tsar Nicholas I had sponsored the expedition, having taken an interest in the geology of his own empire and wanting a famous Briton to map it. His local guides, patient with the visitors' slow pace, said little. The geologist himself was 49 years old, well-fed and well-funded, and looking at something that did not quite fit. Below him, the layers descended into the limestone of the Carboniferous, coal-bearing, familiar, already mapped by other men. Above, eventually, came the muddy reds of what Europe had agreed to call the New Red Sandstone, which most geologists were beginning to recognize as Triassic in age. But between the two, in this bluff and in others like it that he had been visiting for weeks, was a sequence of beds that belonged to neither. Murchison did not write much in his notebook that day. The entry, when he made it later, was cautious, uncertain whether the rocks were the top of one known system or the bottom of another. He would not publish anything definitive for months. When he finally did, later in 1841, he gave the layers a name borrowed from a Russian province along the Ural Mountains, Perm. Centuries earlier, a medieval kingdom of the same name had vanished from the map. Modern administrative boundaries had been drawn over its ruins. The geology, it would turn out, was older than either, and stranger than anything he could have suspected from a bluff above a river in May. What Murchison was looking at without realizing it was the closing chamber of a world that had run for 47 million years and ended, in the best dating we now have, in less than 60,000. That last number is worth holding for a moment. 60,000 years. The whole arc of modern human history fits inside that span. The cities, the languages, the agriculture, the wars, every photograph that has ever been taken. You, sitting wherever you are sitting now and listening to this. All of it would slip with room to spare inside the closing event of the world Murchison had just stumbled into. Set the spans against each other and the picture sharpens. The dinosaurs ruled the Earth for about 170 million years and have been gone for 66. The Permian alone lasted 47. It began with creatures whose teeth had only recently learned to tell a front incisor from a back molar. It ended in a quiet so deep that the rock layers preserve almost nothing inside it. 3 centimeters of clay in a roadside section in southern China that contain the closing chord of an entire planetary order. The geography of that world would not have helped you. Familiar coastlines either had not yet formed or no longer existed. Africa was joined to South America, which was joined to Antarctica, which was joined to Australia, which in turn touched India. North America and Eurasia were welded together along a single suture running through what is now the eastern United States. There were no Atlantic, no Indian Ocean, no Mediterranean. Only one ocean going by the name Panthalassa, which is to say, all sea. The interior of the supercontinent, sun-bleached, monsoon-driven, vast in a way no modern continent is allowed to be, sat in places 3,000 kilometers from any coastline at all. On those interior plains, summer reached temperatures no modern desert ever sees. Winter, in the same place, was a cold the planet does not allow itself anymore. The animals walking across that supercontinent were not what most people picture when they imagine the deep past. There were no dinosaurs yet. There would not be any for tens of millions of years. The dominant land vertebrates of the early Permian were synapsids, a lineage you have probably heard misnamed as mammal-like reptiles, except that they were neither mammals nor reptiles. Synapsids had split from the lineage that would eventually lead to lizards, snakes, and dinosaurs sometime around 310 million years ago. By the start of the Permian, they had been heading their own direction long enough to dominate the planet on their own terms. Most famous of them all, the one with the great sail along its back, the one mistaken in museum gift shops and toy aisles for a dinosaur, is Dimetrodon. You are more closely related to Dimetrodon than Dimetrodon was to a Stegosaurus, and so is every mammal you have ever met. Across the 47 million years that followed, that synapsid lineage would change in ways that look, in retrospect, like a long and patient rehearsal for something we eventually became. The sail-backed predators gave way in time to a group called the Therapsids. Therapsids in turn gave way to cynodonts, and cynodonts eventually gave way to mammals, though the road from one end of that sentence to the other ran through a great deal of wreckage. There was, somewhere in the middle of the Permian, a quiet first warning that almost nobody talks about. There were rivers and forests and entire ecosystems we have no surviving comparison for. And there was, at the very end, a closing event so sudden and so complete that of every 4 species in the ocean, 3 were simply gone, and the air itself by then had begun to change its chemistry. What is unusual about the Permian when you sit with it for a while is not how long it ran or how severe its ending was. It is that everything that mattered to our particular branch of life was already underway inside it, quietly, in the corners, in lineages no one would have called important if there had been anyone there to call anything important at all. Our family tree was already deep into one of its most consequential chapters before the first dinosaur was born. We simply did not yet exist to notice. And maybe that is part of why these walks back are worth taking slowly. If you find yourself drawn to this kind of listening, long-form, quiet, unhurried, consider subscribing to keep them coming. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Your city, the hour where you are. There is something I like about knowing who is in the room when we open something this old. Before we walk into the world Murchison glimpsed and could not yet name, we have to go back further than he did, past the bluff above the Kliasma River, past the limestone he was using as his lower bound. 300 million years ago, the continents had not yet finished arriving at each other, and the air around them, for reasons we are still working out, carried more oxygen than the world has carried since. 300 million years ago, on the western edge of what is now the Appalachian Mountains, the last seam of a long collision was finally welding shut. The Appalachians at that moment did not look like the worn green ridges you can drive through today. They were sharp, raw, and Himalayan, the kind of mountain range that takes geological time to soften. They had been rising for perhaps 100 million years already, lifted by the slow, grinding approach of 2 enormous land masses, and they marked the place where North America and Eurasia, which had existed for most of the planet's history as separate worlds, had finally pressed themselves into a single continent. Far to the south, along what would one day become the coast of West Africa, another suture was closing, the one between Gondwana and the northern continents. By the time the Permian opened, every major piece of land on Earth had arrived at the same address, and for the next 100 million years, with very few exceptions, they would all stay there. This is the world geologists call Pangaea, from the Greek for all Earth. That name was given to it in 1915 by a German meteorologist named Alfred Wegener, who had spent the better part of a decade trying to convince a hostile scientific community that the continents had once been joined and had drifted apart. He died before being believed. His evidence, the matching coastlines, the matching rock sequences, the same fossils on continents now separated by oceans, would eventually be vindicated by mid-20th century discoveries about the seafloor. But Wegener never knew. He died in 1930 on the Greenland ice sheet of heart failure on a research expedition. It was not until the 1960s that the geological mainstream finally caught up with him. What he was right about, though, has only deepened in significance the more we have learned. The supercontinent of the Permian was not just a curiosity of plate tectonics. It was the single most important fact about the climate of the world we are walking into. To understand why, you have to think for a moment about what an ocean does. Air that travels over open water picks up moisture. Air that travels over land tends to lose it. The deeper you go into a continent, the drier the air arriving on you tends to be. On the modern Earth, this effect is real but limited. Even the deepest interior of Central Asia, the part of the world that sits farthest from any sea, is no more than about 2,500 kilometers from a coastline. The interior of Pangaea was farther, in some places considerably farther. A point in what is now Central Africa, in the Permian, sat roughly 3,000 kilometers from the nearest open ocean, and on the inland side of a mountain range no less, so that any moisture trying to reach it had to climb first. The result was a continent whose interior plains, particularly in the equatorial belt, received almost no rain at all for most of the year. They were also, because of their distance from any thermal buffer, subject to summer heat and winter cold of a kind no modern continent allows. The temperature inside Pangaea, in places, would swing across the year by margins that would be lethal to most living things. We know this from the rocks. Thick beds of red sandstone, salt deposits, and wind-blown dune sequences mark out the dry belts on every Permian continent that geologists have mapped. But the supercontinent was not uniformly dry. What it had instead, what climate models began to reconstruct in the 1980s and have refined steadily since, was a monsoon. Not a small one of the kind India still experiences every summer, but a continental-scale weather machine that geologists eventually started calling the megamonsoon. Each summer, the interior of the southern hemisphere baked under direct sun, the air above it heated and rose, and a low-pressure system formed that pulled moist air inland from the eastern coast. Each winter, the heating reversed, and the system drove dry air back toward the sea. Coastal regions on the right side of this cycle saw seasons that flipped between flooding rains and bone-dry months. The animals and plants of those coasts evolved around the rhythm. The interior, far from the moisture, simply went without. You can read this rhythm directly in the soil if you know how. Permian-age sandstones from what is now the western United States preserve the wind directions of 300 million years ago in the way the dunes were stacked. The grain of those dunes points in a single dominant direction in the early Permian and shifts as the period continues, exactly the way you would expect if a monsoon system were strengthening underneath them. The Colorado Plateau, in this sense, is partly a fossilized weather report. There is one more thing worth saying about the air of that world, because it matters for almost everything that comes later. The atmospheric oxygen content of the Permian was not what you and I are used to. It had reached, sometime in the late Carboniferous, an estimated 30%, which is to say, it was nearly half again as oxygen-rich as the air you are breathing right now. That extraordinary level had been built up by the great coal forests of the Carboniferous, whose dead wood, falling into swamps where bacteria could not yet break it down efficiently, had locked away enormous quantities of carbon and left the corresponding oxygen in the air. By the early Permian, the forests were beginning to retreat as the climate dried, and the oxygen began its long descent. By the late Permian, atmospheric oxygen had fallen to something close to 15%, barely above the level at which humans begin to feel altitude sickness. A creature that lived at sea level in the late Permian was breathing air thinner than the air at the top of many mountain passes today. That detail will come back to matter at the end of our story. But standing here in the early Permian, with the world only just settled and the oxygen still high, what you would notice first, if you could be set down in it for an afternoon, is something far simpler. Almost everything around you, the trees, the cliffs, the river deltas, the distant haze that suggests a coastline behind it, would belong to a world organized in a way the modern Earth no longer permits. There would be no Atlantic at your back, no Pacific in your imagination, no Mediterranean somewhere to the east. Just one continent, very large, going as far in every direction as the curvature of the Earth allowed, and one ocean wrapping around it. The sky above you, depending on the season, would either smell of rain coming 1,000 kilometers off the eastern coast, or of dust that had not been wet in a decade. If that geography is hard to picture, there is a small mental trick that makes it easier. Take a globe, or close your eyes and imagine one, and pull every continent inward until they all touch. North America comes down and closes against the western bulge of Africa. South America joins underneath it. Antarctica swings up and locks against the south of Africa, with India and Australia tucked along its eastern flank. Eurasia comes down from the north and welds onto the top of North America. What you are left with, if you do this honestly, is a single C-shaped landmass opening eastward into a great gulf that geologists call the Tethys Sea, and surrounded otherwise by an ocean that has no other name because there is nothing else for it to be next to. Spin the globe, and the supercontinent dominates one side. The other side is unbroken water from pole to pole. That is the world the early Permian inherited. The animals walking through it had inherited something else as well, and they had been at it longer than you might think. Here is something almost no museum gets right. Dimetrodon, the famous one with the great bony sail running down its back, the one you have probably seen on placemats and lunch boxes and the side of cereal boxes since you were a child, is more closely related to you than it is to any dinosaur that has ever lived. The same is true of the cow grazing in a field outside the town nearest you. The same is true of every dog, every whale, every bat, every mouse and pangolin and platypus on the planet. We are all, every one of us, on one branch of an old split. Dimetrodon is on the same branch. The dinosaurs were not. This is not a matter of opinion or interpretation. It is a matter of bone. Roughly 310 million years ago in the late Carboniferous, a population of small lizard-like animals living in coal forest swamps split into two lineages. From the outside, the difference between them was almost invisible. Both groups looked like compact, four-legged, scrambling reptiles, neither of them yet committed to anything you would recognize. But on the inside of the skull, behind each eye, a small architectural decision was beginning to set. One lineage developed a single opening in the side of the skull, a hole through which jaw muscles could anchor. The other lineage developed two such openings. That single skull feature, one hole or two, almost trivially small in the early animals carrying it, would, 300 million years later, define the deepest division in the entire family tree of land vertebrates. The one-hole lineage is called the synapsids. We are synapsids. Every mammal alive is a synapsid. The two-hole lineage is called the sauropsids, and it includes everything else: the lizards, the snakes, the turtles, the crocodiles, the birds, and yes, all the dinosaurs. By the time the Permian opened, these two branches had been separated for somewhere between 15 and 20 million years already. By the time Dimetrodon was walking through the red-bedded landscapes of what is now Texas, around 290 million years ago, the synapsid lineage had been on its own evolutionary road for the equivalent of the entire post-dinosaur era we now live in. This is the part that tends to startle people when they first sit with it. The genealogical distance between you and Dimetrodon, measured in branches on a tree, is shorter than the genealogical distance between Dimetrodon and Stegosaurus. Stegosaurus is a dinosaur, which is to say it is on the sauropsid side of the Great Carboniferous split, closer in family terms to a modern crocodile or a pigeon than to anything with hair. Dimetrodon, despite the surface impression of scales and reptilian limbs and what looks for all the world like a lizard's skull, sits on the other side of the divide entirely. If you could somehow assemble a family reunion of every land vertebrate that has ever existed, sorting them strictly by ancestry, Dimetrodon would be in the same group photograph as a house cat. Stegosaurus would be in a different group photograph on the other side of the field. The reason this feels strange is that we have been taught the deep past wrong, and the wrongness goes back at least to the Victorian era. When the first synapsid skeletons came out of the rocks in the 1800s, paleontologists noticed they had a sprawling, lizard-like posture and limbs held out from the body, and they slotted them into a category that English-speaking science would call mammal-like reptiles for the better part of the next century. The phrase was meant kindly. It was meant to indicate that these creatures sat somewhere between reptiles and mammals on a ladder of progress. But the ladder was the problem. There is no ladder. Synapsids are not transitional reptiles. They never were reptiles. They split from the reptile lineage 310 million years ago, headed in their own direction, and never came back. The mammals you know, your dog, the rabbit in the field, the dolphin in the bay, are simply the latest forms that lineage has taken. The implications, once you let them settle, are not small. The first time a vertebrate evolved differentiated teeth, incisors at the front for biting, canines for piercing, molars at the back for processing. It happened on the synapside branch, in animals like Dimetrodon. The first time a vertebrate evolved a powerful, single temporal fenestra-anchored bite, it happened on the synapside branch. The first time a land vertebrate became truly large and ecologically dominant, in the sense of being unambiguously the apex predator of its world, it happened on the synapside branch. The teeth in your mouth right now, the 4 flat incisors at the front, the pointed canines on each side, the grinding molars at the back, are descended by an unbroken line of inheritance from a dental architecture that first appeared in animals walking around in the early Permian. You can run your tongue along the same structure that a Dimetrodon was using to take apart amphibians near a river bend in West Texas 290 million years ago. The dinosaurs, by contrast, came much later and from the other branch. The first true dinosaur appeared roughly 235 million years ago in the middle of the Triassic, which is to say somewhere around 55 million years after Dimetrodon was already gone, and well into a story that by then the synapsids had nearly lost. We will get to how they nearly lost it, but standing here in the early Permian, what you are looking at is not a primitive rehearsal for the age of dinosaurs. You are looking at a world that the synapsid lineage already owned. The sauropsid branch, the future home of the dinosaurs, the future home of every reptile and bird you will ever see, was, in the early Permian, a much smaller and quieter affair. Most early sauropsids were modest little creatures, scurrying in the undergrowth, surviving as best they could on the margins of an ecosystem dominated, top to bottom, by their cousins on the other side of the family. For 30 million years at the start of the Permian, this was the order of things. Synapsids were the apex predators. Synapsids were the dominant herbivores. Synapsids were the medium-sized hunters and the small omnivores, and in many ecosystems, even the scavengers. There was a whole landscape of body plans and ecological roles, all on the mammal side of the Great Divide, with the reptile side relegated to whatever niches were not yet claimed. If you had visited the Permian Earth without knowing any of this in advance, and someone had told you that one of these 2 branches was destined to inherit the planet for hundreds of millions of years, your honest guess would almost certainly have been wrong. You would have looked at the largest and most impressive animals around, the sail-backed predators, the broad-bodied herbivores, the strange thick-skulled grazers we will meet shortly, and you would have placed your bet on them, and in a sense you would not have been mistaken. The synapsid lineage did inherit a planet, It just had to lose almost everything first. There is one detail in all of this that I find genuinely moving, and I am going to say it plainly because the field is sometimes too cautious to. The Permian Earth was the first chapter of our own story written on a planetary scale. Not the rehearsal for it, not the prelude to it. The first chapter. Everything that has happened since to the animals we are descended from. The long shrinking down through the Triassic, the 80 million years of small nocturnal hiding through the age of dinosaurs, the explosive flowering after the dinosaurs were gone. All of it is the second and third and fourth chapters of a book that opened in the Permian. When you look at a museum reconstruction of Dimetrodon and feel that flicker of recognition, that slight wrongness of seeing it slotted into the dinosaur exhibit, you are not making an aesthetic mistake. You are remembering something correctly that the museum has gotten quietly wrong for 150 years. And the most striking member of that early synapsid world, the one whose anatomy first showed how strange and how successful this lineage could become, was Dimetrodon itself. A full-grown Dimetrodon stood about 3 meters long from snout to tail tip, weighed somewhere between 100 and 200 kilograms depending on the species, and carried, running down the length of its back, a structure that no living animal can quite be compared to. The sail was real bone. The vertebrae of the spine extended upward into long, narrow processes, neural spines in anatomical language, and these extensions could reach more than 1 meter in height. Between them, in life, stretched a sheet of skin, threaded with blood vessels, taut as the canvas of a small boat. From the front, with the sail raised in profile, the animal would have looked nearly twice as tall as its body otherwise allowed. From a distance, depending on how the light caught it, the sail may have flushed and paled with the animal's mood and circulation, the way the skin of certain modern lizards still does. Nobody who ever saw one in life left a description, and nobody ever will. We have only the bones. The bones, however, are good. Dimetrodon is one of the best-known fossil predators on Earth, in the sense that we have many specimens from many ages of many species recovered from the red-bedded sediments that stretch across what are now Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and parts of Germany. The first scientifically described skeletons came out of the rocks in the 1870s, named by the American paleontologist Edward Drinker Cope. The genus name he chose, Dimetrodon, means 2 measures of teeth, a reference to the most striking feature of the animal's mouth. Unlike the simple, near-identical peg-like teeth of earlier reptiles and amphibians, Dimetrodon had begun to specialize. The teeth at the front of the upper jaw were short and gripping. Behind them, on each side, sat a pair of long, blade-like canines, serrated along the edges. Behind the canines, smaller cutting teeth ran toward the back of the jaw. This was not a generalist mouth. It was a hunter's mouth, and a particular kind of hunter, one that could grab, hold, puncture, and slice in a single coordinated bite. What that mouth was eating, we know in considerable detail. Bite marks have been found on the bones of large amphibians from the same beds. Coprolites, which is to say fossilized droppings, have been recovered with the partly digested bones of fish and tetrapods inside them. Some of those bones, on close examination, show signs of having come from other Dimetrodons. The early Permian apex predator, in other words, ate other apex predators. It ate juveniles of its own kind. It also ate, in great quantities, the long-bodied, wide-headed amphibians that dominated the rivers and lakes of the time. Animals like Eriops, which could reach lengths of 2 meters and which represented in the early Permian the last great moment of dominance for the amphibian lineage on land. Dimetrodon's role in the ecosystem was simple and unambiguous. It was the largest carnivore in its world, and it ate, more or less, whatever else it could catch. The sail is the part that sets imagination going, and it is also the part that science is least confident about. The traditional explanation, the one repeated in encyclopedias and textbooks for the better part of the 20th century, is that the sail was a thermoregulatory organ, a kind of solar panel for warming the body in the cool of the morning and a kind of radiator for shedding heat at the hottest part of the day. The argument is intuitive. The sail is large. It is highly vascularized, judging by the channels in the bone where blood vessels ran. Turn it to the rising sun and you would warm faster than your prey. Turn it edge on at noon and you would cool faster than you would otherwise. For a cold-blooded animal in a strongly seasonal climate, the advantage seems obvious. The trouble is that when you actually run the numbers, the math does not behave as cleanly as the story suggests. Detailed studies over the past 2 decades, by Stephen Huck in the 1980s and refined by several teams since, have looked at the surface area of the sail relative to the body mass of the animal, the likely density of blood flow, and the rate at which a structure of this geometry could shed or absorb heat in realistic Permian conditions. The picture that has emerged is mixed. The sail probably did contribute something to thermoregulation, but it was not a finely tuned heat exchanger. It was at best a partial and inefficient one. Worse, sails of similar proportional size appear in some of the smaller Dimetrodon species, animals that, by the rules of body size physics, did not need them for heat management at all. A jackal-sized predator does not need a meter of vascular skin to warm itself up. The thermoregulation hypothesis explains some of the data. It does not explain all of it. What else then? There are other possibilities, none of them mutually exclusive, and the current consensus, to the extent there is one, is that the sail almost certainly served more than a single purpose. Display, for one, the sheer visibility of a raised sail in a landscape where most other animals were low-slung and unornamented would have made Dimetrodon an unmistakable presence at distance. Sexual signaling, for another. Many living vertebrates evolve elaborate visible structures specifically because their potential mates are paying attention to them, and there is no reason to assume a Permian predator was immune to that pressure. Species recognition is a third candidate. Different Dimetrodon species had subtly different sail shapes, and a young animal would have benefited from being able to identify members of its own kind at a glance, particularly in territory shared with relatives. There is even a quieter possibility, raised in some recent papers, that the sail's primary function was simply to make the animal look larger and more dangerous than it actually was, a kind of permanent threat display worn on the back. We are not certain which of these did most of the evolutionary work. We may never be. What is striking, and what tends to get missed in popular accounts, is that the sail was not a one-off Permian curiosity. Several other animals from the same time and lineage carried similar structures. Edaphosaurus, a large herbivore that shared the early Permian landscape with Dimetrodon, also had a sail, but with a crucial anatomical difference: a series of small horizontal crossbars projecting from the neural spines that have no obvious counterpart in any modern vertebrate. Sphenacodon, a close relative of Dimetrodon, had elongated neural spines that did not quite extend into a sail, but suggested, in profile, that the architectural beginning was already there. Whatever evolutionary pressure was favoring tall back structures in the early Permian, it was favoring them across multiple lineages. The pressure was real. We are still working out what it was. Standing on the floodplains of what is now north-central Texas 290 million years ago, the world a hunting Dimetrodon moved through was warm, humid and dense with the kind of life that would not survive into our own era. Tree-sized lycopods, relatives of the modern club mosses, but towering 30 meters or more, still grew in the wetter lowlands, the last great heirs of the Carboniferous coal forests. Cycad-like plants and seed ferns spread across the drier ground. Dragonfly relatives the size of small hawks moved through the canopy, a fading inheritance from the high-oxygen world of the previous period. Giant amphibians lay along the riverbanks. Smaller synapsids, edaphosaurids and their cousins browsed among the ferns. Reptiles in the modern sense, animals on the sauropsid side of the Great Divide, were present but not yet impressive, scurrying through the undergrowth in shapes a casual observer would have dismissed as small lizards. The center of gravity of that whole ecosystem, ecologically speaking, sat firmly on the synapsid side, and at the top of the synapsid side, with its back lit and its teeth differentiated, and its eye on every other animal in the floodplain, sat the sail-backed apex itself. This was the dominant order of things for the first 30 million years of the Permian. It would not last. There is a stretch of the Permian fossil record between roughly 272 and 260 million years ago where the rocks go quiet. Not silent exactly. Sediments were still being laid down in basins around the world. Time was passing as it always passes. Plants were growing and dying and adding their carbon to the soils. Rivers were finding new channels and abandoning old ones. The Earth was doing what the Earth does, but for reasons that are not yet fully understood, the bones of the animals living through that interval are scarce, far scarcer than they should be, given everything we know about what came before it and what came after. The interval has a name. Paleontologists call it Olson's Gap, after the American vertebrate paleontologist Everett Olson, who spent much of his career working on Permian tetrapod faunas and who first drew attention in the 1960s to the strange poverty of the fossil record in this particular slice of geological time. Olson noticed something straightforward and unsettling. On one side of the gap, the rocks of the early Permian were full of synapsids, the sail-backed apex predators we have just been walking with, and their relatives dominating the continents in the way they had for 30 million years. On the other side of the gap, the rocks of the middle Permian were full of synapsids again, but a different kind. The pelycosaurs were gone. In their place were the therapsids, a more advanced branch of the same lineage, with limbs held more directly under the body, with teeth more thoroughly differentiated, with skulls that suggested a metabolism beginning to step away from the slow, sun-dependent style of the earlier animals. The replacement was almost total, and in between the two faunas in the rocks dating to that thin interval of perhaps 12 million years, there is very little to be found. 12 million years is a substantial span by any measure. To make it concrete, it is roughly twice as long as the entire history of the genus Homo. Whatever happened in that interval, however many generations of animals lived and reproduced and died across it, however many ecosystems opened and closed and were replaced, very little of the record has survived for us to read. We know roughly when the gap begins and roughly when it ends. We know that the cast of characters before it is not the cast of characters after it. We do not know with any clarity what occurred between. This is the kind of problem that paleontologists handle in two distinct ways, and the two ways disagree with each other in instructive fashion. The first interpretation, the more cautious of the two, is that Olson's Gap is not really an event. It is a preservational artifact. Across most of the world, the conditions for fossilizing land animals are difficult and rare. You need an animal to die in the right place. You need the right kind of sediment to bury it quickly. You need the right chemistry to mineralize the bones before they rot. And you need the resulting rock to survive hundreds of millions of years of subsequent geological activity without being eroded, metamorphosed, or subducted. The vast majority of land animals that have ever lived have left no trace at all. Most periods of Earth history have, somewhere in them, intervals where the preservation conditions were unusually poor and the fossil record correspondingly thin. Maybe Olson's Gap is one of those. Maybe the animals were there, doing what animals do, and the rocks simply failed to record them. The second interpretation is harder to dismiss and harder to live with. It is that the gap is not just a failure of preservation, but a real biological event, that something happened across that 12 million year interval, which thinned out the dominant fauna of the early Permian and cleared the ecological space for the Therapsids to rise. An extinction, in other words, even if a quiet and stretched out one. There is suggestive evidence on this side too. In the basins where the rocks of that interval are best preserved, and there are some, though not many, the fauna does seem to be impoverished, not just rare. The pelycosaur lineage genuinely does seem to be diminishing. Something does seem to be happening on the ground, not just to the rocks. The honest answer is that we do not know which of these readings is closer to the truth, and we may never know. The gap is, by its nature, an absence, and absence is the hardest thing in science to interpret, because it can be made of so many different kinds of nothing. A region could be empty because nothing was there. It could be empty because what was there was not preserved. It could be empty because what was preserved was later destroyed. It could be empty because nobody has yet found what was preserved. All four of these possibilities apply in some measure to Olson's gap. Different combinations of them have been favored by different generations of researchers, and the field has not yet settled on a verdict. What I find worth pausing over is how much of Earth's history has this same shape. We tend, when we look at a fossil record laid out in textbook diagrams, to see it as a continuous strip, a film reel running smoothly from one period into the next, with every frame in its place. The reality is closer to a film reel found in a flooded basement, with most of the frames missing, some scrambled, some stuck together, some replaced by frames from other reels altogether. The story is reconstructed from what survived. Whole eras have left us almost nothing. Other eras have left us so much that we mistake their richness for normality. The Middle Permian, sitting awkwardly between the well-preserved early Permian and the well-preserved late Permian, simply happened to fall into one of the bad patches. Or, more honestly, into a patch where what was lost from the rocks may also have been lost from the world. We are not yet sure which. When the gap finally closes, when we pick up the trail again, around 260 million years ago, the world has been recast. The Therapsids are everywhere. They occupy the predator niches, the herbivore niches, and a great many in between. They have body plans the early Permian never produced. They have ways of holding themselves, ways of feeding, ways of moving that mark them as a distinctly different kind of synapsid from the sail-backed forms that came before. The story has stepped forward without us. Whoever the actors were across the missing 12 million years, they handed the stage to a new generation, and the new generation walked on without explanation. There is a temptation in moments like this to fill the silence, to narrate what may have happened, to imagine on the listener's behalf the particular droughts or the particular climate shifts or the particular ecological pressures that drove the changeover. I am going to resist that temptation because the rocks do not yet support it. What we have is a beginning we can describe, an ending we can describe, and a middle we cannot. Sometimes the most truthful thing the science can offer is the shape of its own ignorance. The Permian's middle is a gap, and the gap belongs in the story alongside everything else. Standing at the far end of it though, looking back across that 12 million year quiet and forward into the world that emerged from it, what is unmistakable is that something genuinely new is now in charge of the continents. Bigger than the pelycosaurs, more organized than the pelycosaurs, stranger in some respects than anything the synapside lineage had yet produced. A herd of moschops moves through the early light of a south-facing valley in what is now the Karoo of South Africa 265 million years ago. They are heavy animals, the largest of them weighing close to 1,000 kilograms, with broad chests, short thick necks, and skulls of a particular and unmistakable design. The bone of the forehead, on a fully grown male, is more than 10 centimeters thick. From a distance, the heads look almost domed, almost ceremonial. The animals move slowly, browsing on the low ferns and seed-bearing plants that fill the valley floor. And now and then, two of the larger males come to a halt, square up to each other, lower their thickened heads, and drive forward into a single heavy collision. The sound, if you were standing close enough to hear it, would be a deep wooden crack audible across the valley. The animals shake themselves, regard each other for a moment with small, calm eyes, and return to feeding. By mid-morning, the herd has drifted down toward the water, leaving the dust of their passing settling slowly in the still air behind them. This is worth pausing over, because animals like moschops have no living comparison. The temptation, looking at a museum reconstruction, is to slot them into a category we already know, to call them mammal relatives or proto-mammals, or to file them away as an awkward chapter on the road to something we recognize. None of this is fair to them. The dinocephalians, the group of therapsids to which moschops belonged, were not failed mammals. They were not unfinished mammals. They were a successful experiment in being an animal, a way of organizing a body that ran for several million years across multiple continents and produced some of the largest land vertebrates the planet had yet seen. They simply did it on a path that we no longer have a representative on. When that branch ended, it ended completely. Nothing alive today is descended from a dinocephalian. Their entire kind closed its eyes for the last time around 260 million years ago, and the lineage left no heirs. What the dinocephalians had instead while they were here was the world. By the Middle Permian, the long quiet of Olson's Gap had given way to a faunal revolution, and the animals walking out the other side were a different order of synapsid altogether. Where Dimetrodon had carried its body in a low sprawl, with limbs held out from the trunk in the manner of a modern lizard, the therapsids stood differently. Their limbs were swung partway underneath, in a posture closer to that of a modern dog than of a modern crocodile. Their gait was more efficient, their endurance almost certainly was greater, and their teeth had taken the differentiation Dimetrodon had begun and pushed it considerably further. The canines longer and more dagger-like in the predators, the molars broader and more grinding in the herbivores, the front of jaw incisors sharper and more specialized in both. These were animals built for sustained activity in a way the early Permian had not produced. The dinocephalians were the first wave of that revolution, and they were extraordinary in their physical extremes. Ankylosaurus, the largest of the predatory members, was a 6-meter animal with a skull more than 80 centimeters long and canines the size of a man's hand. It hunted across the same Karoo floodplains where the moschops' herds grazed, and the rocks of the Tapinocephalus assemblage zone, the lowest of the great therapsid biozones in the South African basin, preserve their footprints, their bones, and their occasional encounters in the same layers. In northern Russia, in a separate basin entirely, dinocephalians of similar build were doing the same work. Esteminosuchus, a herbivorous member with elaborate bony horns projecting from its skull, lived along the river systems of what is now the Perm region, the very ground Murchison would walk over in 1841, more than 260 million years later, without yet knowing what lay beneath his feet. The dinocephalian distribution was effectively global across what was then a single connected supercontinent, and the group held its dominance for several million years. What the headbutting was for in animals like moschops is one of those questions paleontology can answer only by analogy. The thickened skull cap, the way the bone is reinforced specifically across the dome, the lack of any other obvious explanation for that much wasted weight on the front of the animal, all of it points in the same direction. The closest living analogue is something like a modern muskox, whose males drive their reinforced foreheads into each other during the rut, or a bighorn sheep, which does the same thing on a smaller scale. The dinocephalians were doing it on a scale neither modern animal can match. A Moskops collision involved more than half a ton of moving bone on each side, decelerating across a few centimeters of contact, with the force of the impact distributed across a skull cap built specifically to absorb it. Whether the contests were over mates, over territory, or over rank within a herd, we cannot say for certain. Probably all three, in different mixtures, in different species. What we can say is that the behavior had been important enough, for long enough, to leave a permanent mark on the bones. A mark that has lasted longer than the entire age of dinosaurs combined. The plant world they fed in was changing too. The great coal forests of the Carboniferous, with their towering club mosses and their oxygen-saturated air, had retreated. In their place, across the drier regions of the supercontinent, conifer-like trees were spreading, early relatives of the modern pines and spruces, though not yet looking quite like them. Cycad-like plants and seed ferns filled the middle stories of the vegetation. In the southern continents of Gondwana, where the climate was still cooler and the seasons more pronounced, an entirely different forest was rising, one we will spend more time inside soon. For the moment, the relevant point is that the herbivores of the Middle Permian had a new menu of plants to work with, and the architecture of their teeth and digestive systems was changing to take advantage of it. The grinding molars of a tapinocephalus were not the simple piercing pegs of an earlier age. They were tools evolved against specific kinds of vegetation, and the animal carrying them was the first wave of what Therapsid herbivory could become. If you had stood at the edge of one of those Karoo valleys 263 million years ago, the landscape in front of you would have felt simultaneously familiar and disorienting. The grass that lines every modern grassland would not yet exist. Grasses themselves were more than 150 million years away from their first appearance. The trees would be wrong. Too few flowering plants, too many reproductive structures that no modern tree carries. The sky overhead would be quieter than any modern sky, because the great radiations of insects that fill our summers with sound were already past their peak, and the radiations of birds that fill our mornings with song were not yet anywhere on the horizon. But the animals on the ground would have moved in ways that you could read. A Moschops drinking at the water's edge would lower its head with a recognizable economy of motion. An Antiosaurus stalking the same water would carry itself with the unmistakable tension of a predator picking its moment. The behaviors would be there, even if the bodies wearing them were strange. You would not feel that you were watching aliens. You would feel, more accurately, that you were watching a draft of the world you grew up in. This was the order of things across the Middle Permian. Dinocephalian dominance on every continent, head-butting Moschops in southern Africa, horn-skulled Estemenosuchus in Russia, dagger-toothed Antiosaurus moving along the floodplains, the whole vast enterprise of synapsid evolution running at full force. It was an empire, in the loose sense in which paleontology uses the word, a faunal regime that held together across millions of years and across a connected world. But empires of this sort do not last by virtue of their size alone. They last because the conditions that produced them stay roughly stable. And the conditions that had produced the Dinocephalians were, even as they fed and fought and sired their offspring through the warming dust of the Karoo, beginning, almost imperceptibly, to slip. The Karoo Basin of South Africa is, by a considerable margin, the most important place on Earth for understanding our own deep ancestry. The figure that paleontologists tend to quote is the thickness of the Beaufort Group itself, the part of the basin that preserves the Permian and Triassic terrestrial vertebrates. More than 2,500 meters of sedimentary rock laid down over roughly 50 million years, containing within it 8 successive vertebrate assemblage zones. That is, 8 distinct stratigraphic intervals, each defined by the particular suite of animals whose bones can be recovered from it. No comparable continuous record of synapsid evolution exists anywhere else on the planet. The Russian Cisuralian sites preserve a portion of the early Permian. The Texas red beds preserve the Dimetrodon world. Sites in China and Tanzania preserve fragments of the Middle Permian fauna. But for the long arc, for the unbroken vertical readout of how synapsids transformed across tens of millions of years, from the dinocephalian dominance of the Middle Permian into the Gorgonopsid empire of the late Permian and onward through the great extinction that ended the period, there is the Karoo, and there is nowhere else. The basin sits in the central interior of South Africa, occupying most of what is now the Western, Northern, and Eastern Cape provinces. To stand inside it today is to stand inside a vast, dry, sparsely vegetated plain, broken by ridges and small mountain ranges, with farms and small towns scattered thinly across the terrain. The rocks underfoot are the sediments of an ancient inland basin, once a low-lying region between mountain ranges, drained by river systems that flowed in from the rising Cape Fold Belt to the south. For tens of millions of years, those rivers carried mud and sand into the basin and laid them down in floodplains, in oxbow lakes, in seasonal pools. The animals that lived along those rivers occasionally died in the right places at the right times, and the floodplain mud closed over them. They remained there, slowly turning to stone for the next 260 million years. The man most closely associated with the modern study of those bones, and the one whose work first gave the Karoo its scientific shape, was a Scottish doctor named Robert Broom. Broom was born in 1866, trained in medicine at the University of Glasgow, and arrived in South Africa in 1897 at the age of 31. He had decided, while still a medical student, that the central problem he wanted to solve was the origin of mammals. He had begun by working on living marsupials and monotremes in Australia, but when he learned that the Karoo rocks were yielding Therapsid skeletons in extraordinary numbers, animals that sat directly on the ancestral line leading to mammals, he understood that the answer he was looking for was buried in southern Africa, and he moved there to retrieve it. For the next 54 years, until his death in 1951 at the age of 81, Broom did exactly that. He practiced medicine in small Karoo towns to support himself. He drove out into the surrounding hills on his free days and found bones. By the end of his life, he had named 369 Therapsid species, attributed to 168 new genera, in a stream of papers and monographs that ran from the 1890s to the 1950s. About 57% of those species are still considered valid today. The rest have been quietly absorbed into other species, recognized as juveniles of forms Broom had separately named as adults, or otherwise superseded by later work. But the figure is not, by the standards of his era, a poor one. The number of holotype specimens any single human being has personally contributed to the science of vertebrate paleontology is small, and the number who have done so on the scale Broom did is smaller still. He effectively established the discipline of Karoo paleontology by himself, in his off hours, while running a country medical practice. There is a less flattering side to this, and I think it should be mentioned because the man's legacy is genuinely complicated. Broom collected at speed, and he collected almost exclusively skulls. The post-cranial skeletons of his specimens, the ribs, the vertebrae, the limb bones, all of which we now recognize as carrying important biological information about how these animals actually moved and lived, were frequently left in the field. The Karoo, in the words of one later commentator, was littered for decades afterward with the headless remains of Therapsids he had not bothered to bring home. He also, on at least one well-documented occasion, sold a substantial number of his specimens privately to the American Museum of Natural History, which led to him being dismissed from his curatorial position at the South African Museum. He was not, by any account, an easy man, but he was an extraordinarily productive one. And the field of paleontology that exists today exists in significant part because Robert Broom, in his 60s and 70s, would knock the gearbox of a borrowed car into neutral and freewheel down the Karoo hills to save petrol, looking for one more skull. What he and his successors built, across more than a century of careful work, is the stratigraphic framework that allows the Karoo to be read as a continuous record. Each of the 8 assemblage zones is named for a characteristic genus, and each represents a particular slice of geological time defined by the animals it contains. The lowest of them, the Dimetrodon assemblage zone, sitting at the base of the Beaufort group, preserves the earliest Middle Permian Therapsid fauna, the world that emerged on the far side of Olson's Gap. Above it lies the Tapinocephalus assemblage zone, the dinocephalian-dominated layer where Moschops and Ankylosaurus walked. Above that, in turn, sits the Pristerognathus assemblage zone, marking the period after the dinocephalians had begun to fall away. Each zone represents perhaps a few million years of deposition, and the boundaries between them are often subtle in the rock. A gradual change in the kinds of bones recovered, the disappearance of some genera, the appearance of others. But across the full vertical column, from the lowest beds to the highest, the cast of characters changes completely. The animals at the top of the section would not have recognized the animals at the bottom. This is the strange and quietly remarkable thing the Karoo offers. In a single continuous stratigraphic exposure, a single set of cliffs in a single semi-arid basin, you can climb from the world of the dinocephalians, through the rise of the gorgonopsids and dicynodonts, through the slow assembly of the late Permian ecosystem, through the closing event of the Permian itself, and out into the recovery world of the Triassic. Each stage of that journey is preserved in physical sediment that you can touch. The transitions between them are not theoretical. They are visible in the rock, in the order the rock requires. Walk up the section vertically, and you walk forward through about 50 million years of synapsid evolution. The Karoo is, in this sense, less a fossil deposit than a vertical library, and one of the very few libraries of its kind that the planet has bothered to preserve. What is preserved is also, by any honest accounting, partial. Even in the Karoo, the fossil record is selective. Most of the animals that lived there left no bones, and most of the bones that were left have not survived to be found. Whole groups are underrepresented. Smaller animals are systematically rarer than larger ones. Soft tissues are almost entirely absent. There are particular intervals where the rocks are themselves poor and where collecting yields little. The picture we have, even from the richest basin on Earth, is a sparse outline of a much fuller world. It is the difference between reading 100 volumes of an encyclopedia with most pages torn out and being there. We are working from the torn pages. We do extraordinarily well with them, but we should not mistake our reconstructions for the world itself. The Karoo's vertical record, for all its richness, is still only one window onto the Permian world. The basin sits in what was, at the time, the southern half of Pangaea, part of the larger landmass of Gondwana, which stretched from the African interior through Antarctica and into Australia and the Indian subcontinent. To understand the world the Karoo therapsids were walking through, you have to step back from the basin itself and look at what was growing across that whole southern continent. Above the herds of dinocephalians, around the rivers where Ankylosaurus stalked, and out across the cooler high latitudes where the climate ran more strongly toward the seasonal, there was a forest of a kind that no living region of the Earth still carries. It had a single dominant tree, and the leaves of that tree, folded into the rocks of 5 separate continents, would one day rewrite our understanding of what the planet itself had been doing. The leaf is shaped like a tongue. It is broad at the rounded outer end, narrows toward the stem, and carries down its length a single prominent midrib with a fine network of secondary veins running off it in a pattern almost recognizably modern. Flatten one in your hand and it would lie close to the size of a goose feather, perhaps a little broader. Pressed into stone in the rocks of the late Permian, the same outline appears in extraordinary numbers, not as scattered fines, but in dense mats, layer upon layer, as though the trees had dropped them all at once. Which almost certainly is what they did. The Glossopteris forests by the late Permian were deciduous. They lived in latitudes where the year ran sharply between long, warm growing seasons and long, cold, dark ones, and at the close of each season they shed their entire canopy in something close to a single act. What is striking about Glossopteris, more than the leaf shape, more than the deciduous habit, more than the seed-bearing reproductive structures that suggest a plant somewhere on the gymnosperm side of the family tree, is where the leaves are found. They are found across 5 continents that today have nothing botanically to do with each other. They are found in the coal beds of eastern Australia, in the Permian sequences of central India, in rocks across southern Africa, in the Permian beds of South America, and perhaps most strikingly, in fossilized form in the rocks of Antarctica itself. Over 70 distinct species have been identified from the Indian sequences alone. The leaves do not simply resemble each other across these regions. In many cases they are, by every diagnostic feature available to us, the same plants, the same species, growing across what are now 5 separate continents, separated by tens of thousands of kilometers of open ocean. This was the observation that began to undo the geological consensus of the 19th century. The Austrian geologist Eduard Suess, working in the 1880s, was among the first to take the distribution seriously. Suess pointed out, sensibly, that the seeds of these plants were too large to be windborne. They could not have floated across vast oceans without rotting. There was no plausible animal vector that could have carried them between southern Africa and Australia. The only honest explanation was that the continents themselves had once been connected, that there had existed sometime in the deep past a single landmass across which Glossopteris had grown without interruption. Suess gave this hypothetical landmass a name, borrowed from the region of central India where the plant fossils had been particularly well described. He called it Gondwana land after the Gondwana people of the Indian interior. The name has stuck. The southern half of Pangaea, the half on which the Karoo Therapsids walked, is still called Gondwana today. Suess himself stopped short of arguing that the continents had moved. His view was closer to the one that prevailed in his era, that broad land bridges had once existed between the now separated regions and had since subsided beneath the sea. It was Alfred Wegener, the same German meteorologist we met at the start of all this, who took the next step. Wegener, in his 1915 book on the origin of continents and oceans, leaned on the Glossopteris distribution as one of his central pieces of evidence. The plant was not just suggestive, it was, for Wegener, conclusive. A seed-bearing tree could not have crossed an ocean. 5 continents holding the same fossil flora could not be coincidence. Therefore, the continents themselves had moved. He did not yet have the mechanism. That would have to wait for the discoveries of seafloor spreading and plate tectonics in the 1960s. But the evidence, in Wegener's hands, was strong enough that the conclusion ought to have followed regardless. It did not in his lifetime. The mainstream of geology rejected him. He died on the Greenland ice sheet in 1930, before being vindicated. But every textbook today that draws Pangaea on its frontispiece, every map that shows the southern continents fitting together into a single ancient landmass, owes a portion of its existence to the fossilized leaves Wegener pointed to and to Suess's careful work the generation before. What the forests themselves were like, what it would have felt like to walk through one in the late Permian, is something we can reconstruct in fair detail, because the conditions that preserved the leaves often preserved a great deal more besides. We know the trees had upright trunks reaching 10 to 20 meters in height in many regions, with branching crowns that produced the characteristic fan of tongue-shaped leaves at their tips. The canopy was relatively open compared to a modern temperate forest, with significant light reaching the forest floor. Beneath the canopy grew lower vegetation, ferns of various kinds, smaller seed plants, mosses and liverworts in the wetter areas. Insects of unfamiliar lineages moved through the understory. There were no flowering plants because flowering plants would not appear for another 100 million years. There were no grasses for the same reason. The ground cover was a different and stranger thing than anything you would walk through in a modern forest, made up of plant lineages that have since either gone extinct or retreated into much smaller and quieter ecological roles. The most haunting of these forests, though, were the ones at the highest latitudes, the Glossopteris stands that grew in what is now Antarctica. The continent in the late Permian was already in its current polar position, drifted close to the South Pole, and the climate there ran through extreme seasonal cycles. In summer, the sun never set for months at a time, and the forest grew at extraordinary rates. The growth rings preserved in fossilized Glossopteris trunks from the Antarctic show wide bands of summer growth packed close to thin bands of dormancy. In winter, the sun did not rise at all. For weeks on end, the forest stood in continuous darkness, leaves shed, sap retreated to the trunk. The entire ecosystem held in a kind of dormancy that no modern temperate or polar forest experiences in quite the same way. We have direct fossilized evidence of this rhythm in the petrified wood. The trees of Antarctica recorded their own seasons, ring by ring, 260 million years before there was anyone to count them. Stand in your imagination for a moment at the edge of one of those Antarctic forests on the last day of the long summer, the sun finally beginning to dip toward a horizon it has not crossed in months, and you would see something it is genuinely difficult to find a comparison for. The trees, all of them at once, beginning to drop their leaves, not gradually, the way a New England maple or a Scottish oak shifts colour across weeks. All of them at the same time, in something close to a single coordinated event lasting perhaps a few days. The forest floor would fill with the tongue-shaped leaves in dense overlapping mats, exactly the mats we now find pressed into stone in the same fossilized form in 5 different parts of the modern world. The mats were a sort of botanical signature, and the planet has kept them. By the time the leaves stopped falling, the polar night would already be coming. The forest would stand bare against the lowering sun and then against the long darkness, until the next summer brought the light back. That whole world, from the Glossopteris-dominated forests of Antarctica through their Australian and Indian and African and South American counterparts, was running on the same quiet seasonal rhythm that the southern continents had been running on for tens of millions of years. The forests were stable. The tree itself was successful. No member of its lineage would survive the Permian. There were 2 great Permian extinctions. We forgot one of them for almost 100 years. The fact that we forgot is, in some ways, more interesting than the event itself. Geologists working through the late 19th and early 20th centuries had every opportunity to notice that something dramatic happened in the Middle Permian. The fossil record on every continent showed the same pattern. Faunas that were rich in dinocephalians at one stratigraphic level were, a few meters higher, simply gone. The dinocephalian dominance that had run across the Middle Permian, the herds of moschops, the dagger-toothed Antiosaurus, the horn-skulled Esteminosaucus drinking at Russian rivers, closed. The animals that came afterward were of a different kind, smaller in some niches and larger in others. and the transition was sharp enough that the Karoo's stratigraphers had been informally calling it a faunal turnover for decades. But the word extinction, with all the weight that word carries, was reserved for the great closing event at the end of the period. The middle Permian shift was treated as a step within the system, not a crisis. Until the 1990s, the textbooks did not really have a name for it. What changed was the marine record. Working through the carbonate sequences of southern China, paleontologists in the early 1990s began to notice that the same kind of sharp turnover was visible in the ocean as well, and at the same stratigraphic level. A particular group of single-celled, shell-building organisms called Fusulinid foraminifera, which had dominated the warm, shallow seas of the Permian for tens of millions of years, were nearly wiped out. So were the long-established reef-building communities of sponges and bryozoans that had built the great carbonate platforms of the late Paleozoic. Brachiopod populations crashed. The numbers suggested a marine extinction event of substantial magnitude, not as severe as the closing event of the Permian itself, but well within the range of what other periods of Earth history have called mass extinctions. By the early 2000s, dating work had pinned the event to the boundary between two of the period's stages, the Capitanian and the Wuchia-Pingian, and the name began to settle. The Capitanian extinction, the Middle Permian crisis, the first warning. Recent work has been narrowing the timing with extraordinary precision. A high-resolution dating study published in 2026 using uranium lead methods on volcanic ash beds from Chinese marine sections placed the end of the Guadalupian and the marine extinction horizon associated with it at 259,857,000 years ago, give or take 84,000 years either way. That is a precision tighter than the entire span of human history. We now know to within roughly the duration of the modern human lineage when the first warning struck. The cause was almost certainly volcanic, and the volcanism in question has a name. The emation traps in what is now the southwestern Chinese province of Sichuan are a large igneous province, the geological term for the surface manifestation of a deep mantle plume that produces vast outpourings of basaltic lava over geologically short intervals. The emation eruptions covered something close to 500,000 square kilometers of southwestern China and adjacent regions with thick basalt flows. The eruptions began underwater on the floor of a shallow sea, and as they progressed, they built up the seafloor, broke the surface, and continued onto land. The total volume erupted is estimated at hundreds of thousands of cubic kilometers, smaller than the much larger eruption that would close the Permian, but enormous by any other measure. What an eruption of this size does to the planet, beyond the local devastation, is alter the chemistry of the air and the ocean. The basalts release sulfur dioxide, which forms aerosols and reflects sunlight, briefly cooling the climate. They also release carbon dioxide in immense quantities, which warms the climate over longer timescales. The combination, short volcanic winters punctuating sustained warming, is hard on living systems. Marine ecosystems suffer particularly. The warmer the surface ocean becomes, the less oxygen it can hold, and the more readily oxygen pore zones expand from the deep ocean upward into the shallows where most marine life lives. The brachiopod losses in the high latitudes during the Capitanian, in some Arctic basins, reached 100% at the genus level. In the equatorial regions where ocean temperatures were already higher, the losses were lower in proportion, but still severe. The pattern fits almost too neatly what climate models predict when a large pulse of volcanic carbon dioxide is added to a planetary system already running warm. On land, the effects were equally clear, even if they took some time to be recognized. The dinocephalians did not survive. The whole group, the head-butting Moscops, the predatory Antiosaurus, The horned Estemminosuchus, every member of every dinocephalian family across every continent, went extinct at the Capitanian boundary. They had run for several million years. They had dominated the middle Permian on every continent we have rocks for, and in the geological space of perhaps a few 100,000 years, they were gone. The Theracephalians, which had existed alongside them as a smaller predator group, were severely reduced. The anomodonts, the herbivorous group that included the dicynodonts, were cut roughly in half. The pariasaurs, those broad-bodied tank-like reptiles that had spread across the supercontinent, lost much of their diversity. The Karoo Basin's own record, where the boundary is best preserved, shows extinction rates approaching those of the much more famous closing event 8 million years later. This is the part that has come into sharper focus in the last 15 years, and it is the part that matters for how we tell the larger story. There was, until quite recently, a tendency in the popular literature to treat the end Permian extinction as a singular catastrophe, a one-time event, unprecedented and unrepeated, that happened because some particular combination of volcanic and atmospheric conditions aligned at exactly the wrong moment. The discovery of the Capitanian extinction has quietly undone that framing. The end Permian was not unprecedented. It was the second of two volcanic-driven extinction crises within the same geological period, separated by about 8 million years, both triggered by large igneous province eruptions on the Asian continent. The mechanism is the same. The animals dying are, in many cases, descendants of the survivors of the previous round. We are looking at a planet that hit the same kind of trigger twice, and the second time, with a system already weakened, the result was very much worse. 8 million years separated the two events. To put that span in perspective, it is roughly twice as long as the entire history of the genus Homo. Across those 8 million years, the supercontinent kept turning. The Therapsids that had survived the Capitanian repopulated the empty niches, evolved into new forms, established new dominant groups. The Gorgonopsians, who would become the apex predators of the late Permian, expanded into the space the dinocephalians had vacated. The dicynodonts, who had been cut in half, recovered and diversified into one of the most successful herbivore lineages the synapsid clade had yet produced. New ecosystems assembled themselves out of the wreckage of the old ones. From the perspective of the animals living through that recovery, the world was healing. From a longer perspective, the perspective of the rocks, which keep the books, the recovery was the dress rehearsal. The Capitanian extinction set a pattern, and the pattern is the part of this chapter I find genuinely unsettling. A large igneous province erupts, the air warms, the oceans lose their oxygen, the old apex predators die out, new apex predators rise from among the survivors, several million years pass, and the world looks healthy again, diverse, populated, settled. And then, at the next throw of the same dice, the same kind of eruption happens again, only larger, and the system that had partly recovered cannot absorb the second blow. We are looking at the late Permian as a single act, but the rocks suggest it was two acts, separated by an interval in which everyone who was paying attention, if anyone had been there to pay attention, should have been afraid. No one was there. The animals lived their lives. The dicynodonts grazed and burrowed. The Gorgonopsians hunted at first light. The Glossopteris forests in the south kept dropping their leaves at the close of every long polar summer, undisturbed in their seasonal rhythm. The supercontinent turned slowly through the late Permian, and the second eruption was 8 million years off, and no one on the planet had any way of knowing it was coming. The warning had already been given. It would not be heard. The animal at the edge of the water is the size of a modern tiger. Its skin is thick and largely hairless, more like the hide of an elephant or a rhinoceros than the fur coat we instinctively imagine on an apex predator. Its head is long and low, set on a powerful neck, and when it opens its mouth, wider than any modern mammal can, the upper canines that drop into view are the length of a child's hand, serrated along their edges, curving down past the lower jaw like the blades they functionally are. The animal is drinking. It has come to this water at the close of the long Karoo afternoon, 254 million years ago, and the herds of Lystrosaurus that share the floodplain have already drifted away from this particular bend of the river. They know what it is. They do not know that its ancestors are not from here. This is Inostrancevia. It is a Gorgonopsian, the dominant predator group of the late Permian, and it is the largest member of that group ever to walk on the southern continents. The genus is named for Alexander Inostrantsev, a Russian geologist who oversaw the original excavations on the northern Dvina River in northwestern Russia between 1899 and 1914. Excavations that yielded, among many other treasures, two near-complete skeletons of an animal so large and so unmistakably predatory that it became, almost immediately, one of the iconic finds of pre-revolutionary Russian paleontology. For more than a century afterward, Inostrancevia was understood to be a Russian animal. Its bones belonged to the cold, high-latitude ecosystems of what is now the Vyatka and Severnaya Dvina basins. South African paleontologists working in the Karoo had their own native gorgonopsids, the rubigenes, a separate African subclade with thicker skull bones and broader snouts. The two groups were separated by more than 11,000 kilometers of supercontinental geography. They lived on different floras, hunted different prey, and represented two independent branches of the same family tree, or so it was understood. In 2010 and 2011, on a farm called Nooitgedacht 68 in the southwestern Karoo, fossil collectors began turning up bones that did not look right. The skull, when it was eventually freed from the rock, was narrow and tall in proportions that did not match any known South African gorgonopsid. The temporal opening at the back of the skull, the gap behind the eye that allowed the jaw muscles to anchor, was smaller than the rubigenes. The skull bones were thinner. The whole architecture was wrong for southern Africa and right for somewhere else entirely. When Christian Camera of the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences and his colleagues finally published their analysis of the specimens in May 2023 in the journal Current Biology, the conclusion was as striking as it was unambiguous. The closest relatives of these animals were not in the Karoo. They were on the other side of the supercontinent, in Russia, more than 11,000 kilometers away. The bones at Nooitgedacht belong to a southern member of the Russian genus Inostrancevia. They named it Inostrancevia africana. What this implies, when you sit with it, is genuinely strange. Sometime in the closing few 100,000 years of the Permian, a population of gorgonopsids belonging to a Russian lineage made its way across the entire breadth of Pangaea, from the cool high-latitude basins of what is now European Russia, southward across the equator, through the arid interior of the supercontinent, and eventually into the southern half of Gondwana, 11,000 kilometers. We do not know how long the journey took. Predators move through space the way landscapes allow, and the Permian supercontinent allowed an enormous amount of movement. There were no ocean barriers between Russia and South Africa, no mountain ranges that could not eventually be skirted, no climatic zones that a thick-skinned, large-bodied carnivore could not in principle cross, given enough generations. The traverse may have happened over many tens of thousands of years, in successive small-range expansions, with each generation pushing a few dozen kilometers further than the last. By the time it ended, the descendants of those Russian animals were standing at the water's edge in the Karoo, drinking from rivers their ancestors had never seen. What made the migration possible, what allowed it to happen at all, is the part of the story that has come into clearer focus in the last few years. and the part that paleontologist Pia Viglietti of the Field Museum in Chicago, one of the co-authors on the camera paper, has emphasized in subsequent commentary. The native African apex predators, the rubigines, had themselves gone extinct shortly before Inostrancevia africana arrives in the Karoo record. Whatever pressures had been mounting in the last million years of the Permian, the warming, the drying, the slow degradation of the ecological networks the rubigines had depended on, had hit them harder than they had hit the broader Gorgonopsid family across the rest of the supercontinent. The Karoo apex predator niche, in other words, was empty, and then it filled, briefly, with an animal whose direct ancestors had been hunting in the cold rivers of Russia. A vacancy in southern Africa, advertised across an entire continent, occupied by an immigrant. The animal itself, judging by the Africana skull, was slightly different from its Russian relatives in ways that suggest it had been shaped by its new environment. Its temporal openings were smaller, which means its bite force was probably lower. The African animal was not as powerful a killer as its northern cousins. Its narrower snout suggests a different prey profile, perhaps focused on the abundant Lystrosaurus and other dicynodonts that crowded the Karoo floodplains, rather than the larger and more dangerous pariasaurs that the Russian Inostrancevia had hunted. It had adapted, in the few 100,000 years available to it, to the resources of the southern continent. It was, by the time it appeared in the Karoo record, recognizably its own creature. It did not last long. Inostrancevia africana appears in the Karoo's Daptocephalus assemblage zone, the highest of the Permian Age vertebrate biozones in the Beaufort group, and disappears within a stratigraphic interval that probably represents no more than a few 100,000 years. Its tenure as the southern continent's apex predator was brief in the geological sense and probably brief in any sense. By the time the closing event of the Permian struck, the great extinction we are still walking toward, Inostrancevia was already on its way out. The animal that crossed 11,000 kilometers of supercontinent to claim a vacant throne held it, in the end, for almost no time at all. There is something quietly affecting about this story, and it is worth saying directly. We tend to think of mass extinctions as singular curtain falls, a fauna in place, a catastrophe, a fauna gone. The actual record is messier. Predators were already migrating, niches were already shifting, lineages were already collapsing locally before the global event began. Inostrancevia africana is a piece of evidence that the late Permian was not stable, that the continents were already in flux, that the ecosystems we like to think of as fixed in their pre-extinction form were in fact rearranging themselves under pressure for hundreds of thousands of years before the closing event arrived. The animal at the edge of the water, drinking in the late Karoo afternoon, is not a creature in its native ecosystem. It is a refugee in someone else's, and the someone else is already gone. What the Gorgonopsians as a group represent, beyond the particular drama of Inostrancevia africana, is the closing flowering of a lineage that had been climbing toward dominance for tens of millions of years. They were the first true saber-toothed predators in the history of life on Earth. The structural innovation, elongated upper canines used for stabbing or slashing prey, set in a skull that could open to a much wider gape than most other predators, would be reinvented much later by the saber-toothed cats of the Cenozoic in animals like Smilodon. The two innovations were entirely independent. Saber teeth in a Gorgonopsian and saber teeth in a Smilodon evolved separately in different lineages, separated by more than 200 million years of intervening Earth history. The Gorgonopsians had it first by a long margin. They were doing it in the late Permian, when the entire mammalian lineage was still represented by small, cynodont-like animals that would not produce a true mammal for another 50 million years. When the Gorgonopsians went extinct at the Permian-Triassic boundary, every single member of every single Gorgonopsid genus, on every continent, gone in the same brief geological interval, the saber-tooth strategy went with them. It would not return for 200 million years. The empty space they left in the ecological imagination of the planet would not be filled until well into the age of mammals, and the animals that eventually filled it, when they arrived, would have no idea that anything had ever stood there before. Were the Gorgonopsians warm-blooded? It is the kind of question that sounds at first like it ought to have a simple answer. The animals look familiar in the way a fossil reconstruction can look familiar. The upright posture, the differentiated teeth, the apex predator behavior, the long canined hunting style that anticipates the saber-toothed cats by 200 million years. They sit on the lineage that leads eventually to mammals. They were the dominant predators of their world. The intuitive guess is that an animal doing what Inostrancevia did, in the way Inostrancevia did it, was probably running its body the way a modern lion or a modern wolf runs its body. Warm-blooded, internally regulated, independent of the sun in the way the modern mammalian lineage now takes for granted. For most of the 20th century, this was effectively the consensus. Therapsids were referred to in textbook after textbook as mammal-like reptiles, a phrase intended to flag the in-between status of these animals on the evolutionary road from cold-blooded ancestors to warm-blooded descendants. The general picture was that endothermy, true mammalian warm-bloodedness, with all its costs and benefits, had evolved gradually across the synapsid lineage over the course of the Permian, with each successive group acquiring a bit more of it than the one before. The pelycosaurs were assumed to be largely cold-blooded. The early therapsids were thought to be partly there. The advanced therapsids of the late Permian, the gorgonopsids, the more derived therocephalians, the early cynodonts, were believed to have crossed most of the way. By the time the closing event of the Permian struck, the lineage was assumed to have produced animals that were already, in essential respects, warm-blooded in the way we are. In July of 2022, a paper appeared in the journal Nature that quietly removed the foundation from underneath that consensus. The paper was led by Ricardo Araujo, a paleontologist working out of the University of Lisbon, and Romain David, a postdoctoral researcher at the Natural History Museum in Paris. Their approach was unusual. Rather than looking at any of the traditional features paleontologists had used to argue about endothermy, bone microstructure, posture, nasal turbinates, ratios of limb proportions, Araujo and David turned to a part of the skull that almost no one had previously considered as a thermal indicator. They looked at the inner ear. The inner ear of any vertebrate, including yours, contains 3 small fluid-filled tubes called the semicircular canals. They are arranged in 3 perpendicular planes, and their function is balance. The fluid inside them sloshes as the head moves, and the brain reads the sloshing to know which way is up, how fast you are turning, and whether you are accelerating. The fluid in question is called endolymph, and its viscosity, its thickness, its resistance to flow, depends on temperature. Warm endolymph flows more easily. Cold endolymph flows more sluggishly. For the canals to work properly, the geometry of the tubes has to be matched to the viscosity of the fluid inside them, which means matched to the body temperature of the animal carrying them. A canal designed for a cold-blooded animal will be the wrong shape for a warm-blooded one, and vice versa. What Araujo and David realized is that this gives paleontology a measurable proxy for body temperature, preserved directly in the bony walls of the inner ear, in animals that have been dead for hundreds of millions of years. They built 3-dimensional models of the semicircular canals from CT scans of more than 50 fossil skulls, therapsids of various kinds, primitive synapsids from the Permian, transitional forms from the Triassic, and proper mammals from later in the Mesozoic. They tracked the geometry of the canals across the lineage. They were looking for the moment when canal shape changed in the way the math required, the moment when the inner ear began to be designed for a warm interior rather than a cold one. The moment came in the late Triassic. Around 233 million years ago, a date that is roughly 20 million years after the closing event of the Permian, deep into the recovery world that followed, the canal geometry shifted abruptly across the cynodont lineage. Body temperatures, as far as the inner ear could record them, went up. The change happened quickly, in the geological sense, across less than a million years, and it happened to a specific subset of advanced cynodonts that would shortly afterward give rise to the first true mammals. Endothermy, the kind we carry in our own bodies, appeared on Earth in the Triassic, not in the Permian. This is, when you sit with it, a substantial reorganization of the picture. The Therapsids of the late Permian, the Gorgonopsids hunting in the Karoo, the dicynodonts grazing across every continent, the Therocephalians, the dinocephalians of the Middle Permian, every member of every advanced synapsid group across the entire 47 million year span of the Permian, were probably not warm-blooded in the modern mammalian sense. They had elements of metabolic flexibility, almost certainly. Some of them may have generated more internal heat than their pelycosaur ancestors. Some of them probably had higher activity levels than a typical modern reptile and could sustain them for longer. But the full package, the high resting metabolism, the constant body temperature, the independence from the sun, was not yet in place. It would not be in place for another 20 million years after Inostrancevia drank from its Karoo waterhole. What this means for the way we ought to imagine those animals is harder to articulate than it sounds. Inostrancevia was not a mammal that happened to have scales. It was not a proto-mammal with most of the work already done. It was its own thing, in a category we no longer have living examples of. An animal somewhere in the broad space between the metabolic strategy of a modern crocodile and the metabolic strategy of a modern dog, but matching neither exactly. The hide-not-fur question we touched on earlier is part of the same picture. The semicircular canal evidence aligns with other recent work suggesting that fur, whiskers, and high-rate metabolism appeared together in the cynodont lineage during the Triassic as a coordinated package. The Therapsids of the Permian had none of those things. They had skin, bone, teeth, behavior, and a metabolism we would find unfamiliar. I want to pause on what this kind of revision means more broadly, because it is the part of the science I find most worth honoring. For 100 years, the mainstream view was that endothermy evolved gradually across the Permian synapsids. The view was reasonable. It fit the evidence available at the time. It was held by careful researchers using the best tools their decade allowed. And then a paper came out in 2022 using a technique no one had previously applied, and the picture moved. The mainstream view of the Permian Therapsids in the next generation of textbooks will be substantially different from the view in the last generation, not because anyone was being careless, but because the evidence has improved. This is what science does when it works correctly. It revises itself. It does not arrive at fixed answers and stand on them. It produces best current guesses, holds them with appropriate humility, and updates them when better evidence comes in. The Permian as we now understand it is not the Permian I would have described to you 20 years ago, and the Permian we understand 20 years from now will probably not be the Permian I am describing to you here. The animals stay the same. The picture sharpens. What this leaves us with, looking back across the late Permian world we have spent the last several chapters inside, is a slightly stranger landscape than the one we may have been carrying. The Gorgonopsians at the water's edge were not warm in the way we are warm. The dicynodonts grazing across the floodplains were running on a metabolism we do not have a good modern analogy for. The Glossopteris forests in the south were dropping their leaves at the close of every long polar summer in air that, by the time we get to the period's final million years, was beginning to do something it had not done in a long time. It was beginning to warm, not from the inside of any animal, but from the outside, from the air itself, from changes in atmospheric chemistry that no living thing on the planet could have noticed yet, and that none of them, however metabolically flexible they were, would be able to outrun. Begin with a single shell. It is the shell of an ostracod, a small, bivalved crustacean about the size of a sesame seed, the kind of animal that has been quietly making its living in the world's oceans for nearly 500 million years, and that continues to do so in your nearest tide pool today. The shell in question is approximately 252.25 million years old. It was deposited on the floor of a shallow sea in what is now northwestern Iran in the closing few 100,000 years of the Permian, and it sat there undisturbed through every subsequent geological convulsion until a research team led by Jana Gliwa of the Museum für Naturkunde in Berlin extracted it, along with hundreds of others like it, from a stratigraphic section near the Iranian city of Mashhad. The shell is 0.2 of a millimeter long. It is calcified. It is, by any honest measure, unremarkable. And the thing it has been quietly carrying inside its calcium carbonate for 252 million years is the chemical signature of the temperature of the seawater it grew in. This is the part of the chapter that requires a small amount of patience because the science is real and the implications are large. Calcium carbonate, the mineral that makes up the shells of ostracods and many other marine invertebrates, contains oxygen. Oxygen comes in two stable isotopes, a lighter one, oxygen-16, and a heavier one, oxygen-18. In warmer seawater, the ratio of the two isotopes incorporated into a growing shell shifts slightly toward the lighter version. In cooler seawater, it shifts slightly toward the heavier. The shift is small, but it is consistent and it is measurable. With the right instruments, and the relevant instrument here is a technique called secondary ion mass spectrometry, which can read isotope ratios in samples almost vanishingly small. You can put an ostracod shell under the beam and ask the mineral what the temperature of its sea was 252 million years ago. The answer comes out in degrees. What Gliwa and her team published in 2022 in the journal Paleontology is the temperature record they were able to reconstruct from the Iranian ostracods across the closing 300,000 years of the Permian. The result was unexpected. For most of the previous 20 years, the prevailing model had been that the warming associated with the end Permian extinction was rapid. A sudden hyperthermal event compressed into perhaps 40,000 years, occurring essentially in step with the main extinction pulse. The Iranian ostracods told a different story. The warming was not sudden. It began at least 300,000 years before the main extinction, climbed gradually over that interval, and reached approximately 12 degrees Celsius above the pre-warming baseline by the time the closing event arrived. The catastrophe was not announced. It built up slowly, through hundreds of generations of marine invertebrates that lived their whole lives inside an environment that was changing under them, in a direction none of them had any way of recognizing. 300,000 years is a substantial span, and it is worth pausing on. To put it in human terms, it is roughly the entire span of the species Homo sapiens. Every member of every culture that has ever called itself human, from the earliest forms in East Africa through every population alive today, falls inside a window of comparable length. The whole of human history, in other words, fits comfortably inside the warming run-up that the Iranian ostracods recorded. Whatever was happening to the air over the late Permian was not a sudden event. It was a long, slow accumulation of a magnitude that by the end of the period's final million years had altered the chemistry of the atmosphere in ways that no living thing on the planet could have noticed yet, and that none of them, however adapted to their local conditions, would be able to step outside of. The driver of the warming, as far as the geochemistry now supports, was carbon dioxide. The first volcanic eruptions of the Siberian traps, the great igneous province whose detailed work we will come to in time, had begun some 300,000 years before the main extinction pulse. These early eruptions were not yet catastrophic. They were the first stage of a much longer event, dominated by surface lava flows, releasing significant but not yet overwhelming quantities of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. The amount of carbon being added was enormous by any modern standard, but spread out over hundreds of thousands of years. The per-century rate was lower than what is being added to the atmosphere today by industrial activity. The ostracods felt it gradually because it was being delivered gradually. The system absorbed what it could in the oceans, in the soils, in the weathering of rocks, and warmed slowly under the rest. What this gradual warming did to the late Permian world is the part of the picture that has come into sharper focus in the last few years, and it is the part that is hardest to reconstruct without leaning on too many parallels to the present. So I will describe it as the rocks describe it, and let the listener carry whatever resonance they wish. The warming reduced the oxygen content of seawater. Warmer oceans hold less dissolved oxygen, and warmer oceans also stratify more strongly, which means the deep cold layers and the shallow warm layers mix less efficiently, and the deep layers in particular begin to lose their oxygen entirely. Across the late Permian, oxygen-poor zones in the deep ocean expanded slowly upward, encroaching on the shelves where most marine life lived. Some marine groups began to decline before the main extinction pulse arrived. The fusulinid foraminifera that had survived the Capitanian crisis began their final retreat. Brachiopod populations in particular regions began to thin. The reefs, weakened already, did not rebuild at the rates they had previously sustained. The animals that were going to survive the closing event were, in many cases, the animals that had already adapted to the warming and the deoxygenation across the previous several 100,000 years. On land, the same atmospheric changes were doing different work. The interior of the supercontinent, which had been arid for most of the Permian, became drier still. Soil moisture decreased. River systems that had run year-round in some regions began to run only seasonally. The vast Glossopteris Forests of Gondwana, which had been keeping their seasonal rhythm for tens of millions of years, began to show signs of strain at their edges, particularly in the lower latitude regions where the warming was felt most acutely. Wildfires recorded in the rocks as charcoal layers became more frequent through the closing few 100,000 years of the period. Plant communities began to shift in composition before they were destroyed. The Therapsids of the Karoo continued their daily lives, the Dicinodonts grazing, the Gorgonopsians hunting, the late arriving Inostrancevia africana drinking from rivers that, by the end, were running thinner than they had run 100,000 years before, and none of them had any way of knowing that the world they were adapting to was a way station, not a destination. There is a temptation when describing this kind of slow build-up to make it sound like a countdown. The countdown framing is useful for narrative purposes, but it misrepresents what was actually happening. The animals living through the late Permian were not aware of any countdown. They were not, in any sense, in the closing chapter of their world. They were simply alive in their own moment, doing the things their lineages had been doing for tens of millions of years, in air that was a little warmer than it had been when their grandparents were young. Each generation experienced its conditions as normal, because each generation experienced the conditions it had been born into. The drift was too slow to be felt within any single lifetime. It would only become visible looking backward from a vantage point hundreds of thousands of years later, by people not yet imaginable, using instruments that did not yet exist, reading shells that would lie undisturbed in Iranian rock for the entire intervening span. The drift was real. The animals were not blind to their world. They were simply living in it, the way every generation lives in its own. What was coming, when it came, would come from outside their experience entirely. The atmosphere had been warming for 300,000 years. The oceans had been losing their oxygen. The forests had been thinning at their edges. None of this had yet exceeded what life could absorb. The system was strained, but it was holding. And then somewhere in the basalt sills working their way through the carbon-rich sedimentary basins of what is now central Siberia, the geometry of the eruption began to change. A kilometer beneath the surface of what is now central Siberia, in the closing chapter of the Permian, a body of magma is moving sideways. It has worked its way up from the mantle along a system of fractures that runs for hundreds of kilometers across the Tunguska Basin, and it has reached the depth where the overlying rocks become too dense to push through directly. Above it lie the sedimentary layers of the basin itself, limestones, mudstones, and, in particular, thick beds of Permian-aged coal, laid down by the wetter forests of the period's earlier chapters, and now buried under hundreds of meters of subsequent sediment. The magma cannot push up through these layers efficiently, so it stops, finds the line of least resistance, and begins to flow horizontally along the bedding planes of the sediments above it, intruding between layers like ink slipped between the pages of a closed book. The geological term for what it forms is a sill. The thing it does to the rocks above it is something that, 252 million years later, would help explain the largest extinction in the history of animal life. For most of the 20th century, the Siberian traps were understood as a surface event. The visible rocks of the province, extensive flood basalts covering an area of roughly 7 million square kilometers, with an estimated original volume between 2 and 5 million cubic kilometers, were the obvious smoking gun. They were the right age, dating to the closing few 100,000 years of the Permian. They were the right scale, larger than any other large igneous province in the Phanerozoic record, and they coincided with increasing dating precision through the 1990s and 2000s, with the marine extinction horizon at Maishan and elsewhere. The reasoning was straightforward. The eruptions released enormous quantities of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide directly to the atmosphere as the lavas reached the surface and degassed. The atmosphere warmed. The oceans deoxygenated. Things died. The Siberian traps were the trigger, and the trigger was the lava. The picture began to shift in the early 2000s and resolved into something quite different by 2017, when a paper by Seth Burgess, Sam Bowring, and James Muirhead in Nature Communications laid out a refined version of the story. Burgess and his collaborators had been doing high-precision uranium lead dating on individual zircon crystals from the Siberian traps, mapping out exactly when each phase of the eruption had occurred. What they found surprised them. The earliest phases of the volcanism, the surface lava flows, which had been the assumed culprit, began approximately 300,000 years before the main extinction pulse. They produced an enormous volume of basalt, perhaps 2/3 of the total, and during that interval the global biosphere shows relatively little disturbance. The fossil record of the early Lopingian, while not pristine, does not show the catastrophic signal one would expect from a planet being killed by surface volcanism. The main extinction pulse comes later, and it comes in coincidence with a different phase of the eruption entirely. The phase that mattered, according to the Burgess work and the studies that have built on it since, was the sill-intrusion phase. Beginning roughly at the same moment the surface lava flows were ending, the magma plumbing system shifted modes. Instead of erupting cleanly to the surface, the new magma began to intrude horizontally into the sedimentary basins of the surrounding crust, into the very rocks the basin had been quietly accumulating for the previous several 100 million years. The rocks the magma was now flowing through were not inert. They were full of organic material, the Permian coal beds in particular, but also limestones rich in carbonate carbon and shales full of buried organic matter were sitting in the sill's path. When magma at temperatures above 1,000 degrees Celsius intrudes into a coal bed, the coal does what coal does. It releases its carbon. Not slowly the way it would in a normal combustion process, but suddenly and at depth, generating enormous volumes of methane, carbon dioxide, and assorted hydrocarbon gases under pressure. These gases then need somewhere to go. What they did, across the closing few tens of thousands of years of the Permian, was force their way upward through whatever fractures and weak points the overlying rocks provided. In some places, they vented at the surface as kimberlite-like pipes, narrow, deep, violent eruptions that punched holes through the sedimentary cover and released their gas loads directly to the atmosphere. In other places, they migrated through the rock more slowly but reached the air eventually. The cumulative effect was an injection of carbon-bearing gases into the atmosphere on a scale that the surface lava flows by themselves had not been capable of producing. And crucially, it was an injection that came from carbon stocks the planet had been quietly burying for hundreds of millions of years. The Permian coal forests of the early period had locked away carbon that should have stayed locked. The sills were releasing it. The numbers, even held loosely, are difficult to absorb. The total carbon released across the sill-intrusion phase has been estimated at several tens of thousands of gigatons. That is, several tens of thousands of billions of tons of carbon delivered into the atmosphere in a window of perhaps 50 to 60,000 years. The release rate per century, while slower than what is being added to the atmosphere today by industrial activity, was within the same order of magnitude during the most intense phases. The ocean's capacity to buffer atmospheric carbon dioxide was overwhelmed. Surface temperatures climbed sharply, ocean pH dropped, the dissolved oxygen content of the seas, already declining gradually across the previous 300,000 years, began to collapse. The closing event of the Permian, when it came not from the lava the geologists had first suspected, but from what the lava had cooked underground. There is something almost grimly elegant about this mechanism, and it is worth pausing to recognize the shape of it. The carbon that closed the Permian was not produced by the eruption itself. It was produced by the eruption's contact with carbon that had been already stored by the planet in the rocks of an earlier age. The Permian's earlier forests, the great coal-producing wetlands of the Carboniferous and the early Permian, which had spent tens of millions of years pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and burying it as plant matter, had built up an enormous reservoir of fossil carbon in the sediments of central Eurasia. The Siberian traps did not simply add their own carbon to the air. They reached into that older reservoir, the one the planet had spent the previous 100 million years carefully filling, and they emptied it. The closing event of the Permian was, in a literal sense, the burning of an earlier Permian. I have to flag the resonance, because not flagging it would be dishonest. The mechanism by which the Permian ended is the same general mechanism by which industrial human civilization is currently altering the Earth's atmosphere, the rapid release of fossil carbon that the planet had previously buried into a system not equipped to absorb it on the timescale of the release. The rate of release in the late Permian, while staggering by the standards of any other geological event, was probably slower than the current human rate. The total volume was larger. The system response, warming, ocean deoxygenation, acidification, mass mortality among the most temperature-sensitive groups, was the same set of feedbacks the Earth runs whenever this kind of carbon injection occurs. I am not going to dwell on the resonance, and I'm not going to use it to argue any particular position about the present. But I am also not going to pretend it is not there. The rocks describe what they describe. The reader and the listener can make of it what they will. The animals, in the closing few tens of thousands of years before the main pulse, were running out of options without knowing it. The dicynodonts on the Karoo floodplains found their grazing areas drying. The Glossopteris Forests of Gondwana, which had begun to thin already, accelerated their decline as the warming sharpened. Marine invertebrates in the high latitudes, where the warming was felt most acutely, began to vanish from the rocks at rates well above background. Inostrancevia africana, the immigrant gorgonopsid that had crossed the supercontinent to claim a vacant throne in southern Africa, hunted in the lengthening dry seasons until the rocks stopped recording its presence. Nothing announced what was coming. The system was sliding toward a threshold, and when it crossed, it would cross suddenly. But for a few more tens of thousands of years, the late Permian world continued to look, from inside it, very much like itself. What was happening underground in central Siberia would not stay underground. The sills were widening, the pressure was building, and in the closing centuries of the Permian, the gases they had been generating began to find their way to the surface in volumes that the atmosphere had not absorbed in a single short interval since the planet had first acquired an atmosphere life could breathe. In a roadside cutting near the village of Meishan, in the Zhejiang province of southeastern China, there is a layer of clay approximately 3 centimeters thick. It is not particularly distinguished to look at. The rocks above it are a pale, shallow marine limestone of early Triassic age. The rocks below it are a pale, shallow marine limestone of late Permian age. The clay sits between them, slightly darker, slightly finer grained, and continuous along the cutting face for many meters in either direction. It is the most studied 3 centimeters of rock on Earth. This clay layer and a small number of equivalent layers in other Permian Triassic boundary sections at Shaanxi in central China, at Penglaitan in the south, at Bulla in the Italian Alps, at Abade in Iran, is the closing event of the Permian as the rocks have preserved it. Above the clay, the marine fauna of the Triassic begins. Below the clay, the marine fauna of the late Permian ends. The clay itself contains the transition in a thickness you could cover with your hand. What that transition was, and how long it took, and why it was as severe as it was, are the questions that have driven Permian Triassic boundary research for the better part of 40 years. Some of those questions now have provisional answers. Some do not, and may not, for a long time yet. The duration question came into focus most sharply through the work of Sam Bowring at MIT, his graduate student Seth Burgess, and their collaborators in the Chinese geological community across a series of papers culminating in a 2014 study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. By dating individual zircon crystals from volcanic ash layers immediately above and below the clay at Meishan, Burgess and Bowring were able to bracket the main extinction pulse to within 60,000 years, plus or minus 48,000. The number that gets quoted in the popular literature is the central estimate. The honest scientific reading is that the main pulse occurred in less than approximately 100,000 years, with the best evidence pointing to something closer to 60. Either way, the number is small. It is small in a way that has reorganized how the field thinks about what mass extinctions can be. To set the duration in human terms, one more time, because the comparison matters. 60,000 years is roughly the span between the earliest evidence of Homo sapiens leaving Africa and the present moment. The cultural arc of the modern human species, the migrations, the languages, the agriculture, the cities, the monuments, the wars, the sciences, every culture that has ever existed, fits inside the closing event of the Permian with room to spare. Whatever happened to the late Permian biosphere, it happened across a span of geological time barely longer than the entire experience of being modern people on this planet. How severe the extinction actually was is a question that has itself been revised across the last decade. The figure quoted for most of the second half of the 20th century, that 96% of marine species went extinct, was based on a calculation by David Raup in 1979 that, in retrospect, made a methodological error. Raup combined the losses across both the Capitanian extinction and the end Permian event without separating them, treating the two as a single crisis. When Stephen Stanley revisited the calculation in 2016, separating the two events and accounting for the slow background extinction that occurs between mass extinction pulses, the number for the end Permian itself came down. His revised estimate was approximately 81% of marine species. This is still the largest known mass extinction in the history of multicellular life. But the older 96% figure, which gets cited in textbooks and documentaries even today, is no longer supported by the methods we now consider best. The kill mechanism, what actually killed the animals in the few tens of thousands of years across which they died, is the question that is least settled, and it is the question I want to spend most of this chapter sitting with because the honesty of where the science is right now feels worth honoring. There is broad agreement on the upstream cause. The Siberian traps released enormous volumes of carbon dioxide. The atmosphere warmed, the oceans warmed with it. From there, the picture becomes a tangle of interacting feedbacks, several of which appear sufficient on their own to cause mass extinction, and which were occurring simultaneously across the same interval, sorting out which one did the most work in which environments on which lineages is genuinely difficult. A leading model developed by Justin Penn and Curtis Deutsch and their colleagues in a 2018 paper in Science focuses on temperature-dependent oxygen depletion. As surface ocean temperatures climbed by something close to 10 degrees Celsius in the tropics, marine animals' metabolic demand for oxygen rose. Simultaneously, warmer water holds less dissolved oxygen, and stronger ocean stratification meant that the deep, oxygen-rich layers stopped mixing with the shallows where most marine life lived. The result was a global crisis of habitat. The warm, shallow seas became aerobically inhospitable to most of their inhabitants, and the cooler, deep waters were too oxygen-poor to be a refuge. Penn and Deutsch's model predicts a particular geographic signature. The extinction should be more severe outside the tropics than within them, because tropical species were already operating closer to their thermal limits and could move toward the poles, while polar species had nowhere cooler to go. The fossil record matches this prediction reasonably well. The model is not the whole story, but it is probably part of it. Other mechanisms appear to have contributed at different scales. Hydrogen sulfide, generated by anaerobic bacteria in the increasingly oxygen-poor oceans, may have built up to toxic concentrations in some marine settings, a phenomenon called euxenia, which is preserved in the rock record as particular sulfur and biomarker signatures. Ocean acidification, driven by the dissolution of atmospheric carbon dioxide into seawater, would have stressed organisms with calcium carbonate shells across the same interval. Some recent work has even suggested that the depletion of stratospheric ozone, possibly caused by halogen compounds released by the Siberian traps eruptions, may have produced a brief spike in ultraviolet radiation reaching the surface, with potential effects on terrestrial ecosystems that have left signatures in malformed pollen grains from the period. None of these mechanisms is ruled out. None of them is conclusively dominant. The animals were dying for several overlapping reasons, in several overlapping environments, across several overlapping timescales. The picture, even as the science improves, remains genuinely complicated. What I want to be careful about in describing this is the temptation to deliver the extinction as a single dramatic event. The rocks, to the extent they preserve detail at this resolution, suggest that the closing event was actually two pulses separated by a brief and partial recovery interval. The first pulse, in the latest Changxingjian, hit certain marine groups particularly hard: the Fusulinid foraminifera, the rugose corals, large sections of the brachiopod community. The recovery interval, which lasted perhaps tens of thousands of years, saw some lineages stabilize and even diversify briefly. Then the second pulse arrived, harder than the first, and finished the work. By the end of the closing event, the Paleozoic marine fauna, the world dominated by brachiopods and crinoids and tabulate corals that had run since the Cambrian, was effectively over. The marine ecosystems that would dominate the Mesozoic and the rest of Earth history would be built from a different set of survivors entirely. I find myself, in writing this chapter, wanting to give the listener a reassuring sentence, something that places the magnitude of the event at a respectful distance. A sentence that says, "But this was long ago, and the world recovered," the kind of phrasing that lets a difficult fact settle without weight. I am not going to write that sentence, because it would not be quite honest. The world did recover, eventually. The recovery took 5 to 10 million years for the basics, and probably closer to 50 million years for the full ecological complexity. The marine ecosystems we have today, with their particular dominance of bivalves and crustaceans and the modern fish, are descended from the survivors of the closing event, not from the dominant Permian groups. The biosphere we now live in is, in a real sense, the post-Permian biosphere. The world that came before it is gone. The rocks remember it. We are still learning to read what they remember. What is most striking, when you sit at the foot of the boundary clay at Maishan and look at the 3 centimeters in front of you, is not how violent the closing event was. It is how quiet. The clay does not contain a record of dramatic events as we would normally picture them. It contains, mostly, the absence of things. The disappearance of the late Permian conodont species. The disappearance of the late Permian foraminifera. The disappearance of the late Permian brachiopods, replaced thinly above the clay by a small and impoverished early Triassic fauna built around survivors. The closing event of the Permian, as it is preserved in the rocks, is mostly a record of animals not being there anymore. The world did not end. It thinned. The thinning happened across about 60,000 years. And on the far side of those 60,000 years, on the same bedding plains the late Permian animals had walked across, almost nothing of the late Permian world remained. What remained on land, what walked through the same closing event in the rocks of the Karoo, and what the South African basin tells us about the version of this story that played out for terrestrial life, followed a different pattern, on a different timescale, through different ecosystems entirely. The terrestrial version of the closing event was, by every measure paleontology has been able to apply to it, a different kind of thing from the marine version. It was slower, it was patchier. It moved across the supercontinent in a particular geographic pattern, beginning in the high latitudes and propagating toward the equator over the course of approximately 1 million years. The animals that died on land did not die in synchrony with the animals that died in the sea. They died in waves, region by region, as the warming of the air and the drying of the soil reached each successive zone of the supercontinent. Some communities collapsed within a few thousand years of the marine pulse. Others held on for hundreds of thousands of years longer before they too were thinned past the point of recovery. The story of the closing event on land is not the story of the closing event in the ocean told from a different angle. It is its own story, and it took longer. This is the part of the picture that has had to be reconstructed slowly against considerable resistance because the older model assumed terrestrial and marine extinctions were synchronous. The synchrony assumption was reasonable. Both events were driven by the same upstream cause, the volcanic carbon release and its atmospheric consequences, and there was no obvious reason to expect the responses on land and in the sea to operate on different timescales. The Karoo Basin record, with its continuous stratigraphic exposure spanning the boundary, was for many decades read as confirming this synchrony. The daptocephalous assemblage zone, the late Permian fauna dominated by Dicenodonts and the late arriving Inostrancevia, gave way relatively abruptly to the Lystrosaurus assemblage zone, the early Triassic recovery fauna. The transition looked sharp. Sharp seemed to mean fast. Fast seemed to mean simultaneous with Meishan. What changed across roughly the last 15 years of work in the Karoo was the precision with which the boundary itself could be read. Detailed sedimentological mapping by Roger Smith, Jennifer Botha, and a generation of South African and international collaborators began to reveal that the transition between the two assemblage zones was not, in fact, a clean cut. It was a transitional interval, perhaps 1 million years thick in places, across which the late Permian fauna thinned gradually. The typical large-bodied Dicenodonts and Pariasaurs and Gorgonopsids declined or vanished species by species, and the surviving forms were progressively replaced by smaller, more drought-tolerant, more burrowing-adapted animals. Lystrosaurus itself, the genus that would become emblematic of the recovery world, appeared in the Karoo well before the marine boundary at Meishan. By the time the Meishan clay was being deposited, Lystrosaurus was already a substantial fraction of the local fauna. The terrestrial extinction was not waiting for the marine extinction. It was running on its own clock. A more recent study by Pia Viglietti and her colleagues, published in 2021 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, used a high-resolution database of nearly 600 fossil occurrences from the Karoo to map the extinction pattern with unprecedented detail. Their result was stark. The terrestrial extinction in southern Africa was not a single event, but a sustained interval of elevated extinction rates, lasting approximately 1 million years and spanning the late Permian and earliest Triassic. Within that interval, there was a sharper acme of loss near the daptocephalous Lystrosaurus boundary, but the surrounding shoulders on either side were also marked by elevated rates. Recovery, when it came, was slow and partial. The Karoo was not killed in a moment. It was thinned across a long interval, and at the end of that interval, the world it had supported for tens of millions of years was no longer there. What was driving the thinning on land was less the same set of mechanisms that operated in the sea. Although ocean acidification and oxygen depletion mattered for marine life, in ways they did not matter for terrestrial life, and more a particular cascade of climatic and ecological changes that the warming and the drying of the supercontinent set in motion. The interior of Pangaea, already arid for most of the Permian, became drier still. River systems that had run year-round in the late Permian Karoo began to run only seasonally. The plant communities that had stabilized the floodplains began to thin, then to fail in patches, then to fail across larger regions. Without the plants, the soils began to erode more rapidly, particularly during the seasonal floods. The fluvial sediments preserved in the Karoo across this interval show a distinctive shift toward what sedimentologists call braided river systems, channels that wandered widely across abandoned floodplains with little stable vegetation to hold the banks in place. The landscape was becoming less hospitable, not in a single dramatic event, but in a slow restructuring that played out across hundreds of thousands of years. The animals that depended on stable plant communities were the first to go. The Pariasaurs, those broad-bodied tank-like reptiles that had grazed across the Karoo in considerable numbers, declined sharply. The larger Dicenodonts followed as their food plants thinned and their water sources became more unreliable. The Gorgonopsids, who had depended on the larger herbivores for prey, declined with their food source. Inostrancevia africana, the immigrant predator we met 2 chapters ago, vanished from the rocks midway through the transitional interval. By the time the boundary itself was being deposited at Meishan, the Karoo's apex predator niche was already empty for the second time. What remained on the southern African floodplains in the closing few tens of thousands of years of the Permian was a thinned and stressed ecosystem dominated by a small number of survivors, a few therocephalian carnivores, a few small dicynodont herbivores, a few cynodonts in their burrows, and the increasingly abundant Lystrosaurus. I want to pause on the Lystrosaurus question for a moment, because the story we have been told about this animal for most of the last century is in the process of being substantially revised, and the revision matters for how we understand survivorship more broadly. The traditional narrative was that Lystrosaurus was a disaster taxon, an opportunistic species that bloomed in the aftermath of the extinction, exploiting the empty niches left by the dominant Permian fauna and reaching abundances that would have been impossible in a healthy ecosystem. The image was of an animal that prospered because everyone else had died. Recent work, particularly the Viglietti analyses and a careful reassessment of the disaster taxon framing by Robert Gastaldo and others, has complicated this picture. Lystrosaurus was already increasing in abundance and geographic range well before the closing event. Its rise predated the catastrophe. The features that made it well suited to the post-extinction world, its small to medium body size, its ability to dig deep burrows, its tolerance of low-quality vegetation, its rapid life history, were already in place before the world it was suited to had arrived. The animal was not a beneficiary of the extinction. It was, more accurately, an animal whose particular adaptations happened to align with the conditions the extinction was producing. This is the part that I find genuinely interesting and worth thinking carefully about. The conventional story about mass extinctions tends to emphasize the role of luck. The survivors are the lucky ones, the unlucky lineages are the dead ones, and the difference between the two is largely arbitrary. The Lystrosaurus revision suggests something more structured. The lineages that came through the closing event were, in many cases, lineages that were already changing in particular directions before the event arrived. Smaller body size, greater behavioral flexibility, more burrowing or estivating habits, broader dietary tolerance. These are not random traits. They are the traits that any animal lineage would acquire if it were responding, generation by generation, to a slowly worsening environment, to drier soils, to thinner plant communities, to more erratic water sources, to more frequent seasonal stress. The animals that survived the closing event were, to a meaningful extent, the animals that had been quietly adapting to the conditions producing the closing event for hundreds of thousands of years before the catastrophe culminated. Survival was not random. It was a long-running process that had been underway in the background throughout the slow approach. What this means for the Karoo's terminal fauna is that the silence that fell across the basin in the closing millennia of the Permian was not a sudden silence. It was the audible result of a long fade-out. The dicynodonts had been losing diversity for hundreds of thousands of years. The gorgonopsids had been losing diversity for hundreds of thousands of years. The pariasaurs had been losing diversity for hundreds of thousands of years. By the time the world they had inhabited was finally gone, the animals carrying that world had already been thinning for so long that the final loss was less a collapse than a closing of the door behind something that had been leaving for some time. What remained on the floodplains of the early Triassic Karoo, when the dust of the closing event had begun to settle, was a strange and impoverished landscape. Lystrosaurus moved across it in considerable numbers. A few therocephalians still hunted in its margins. A few cynodonts, the lineage that would eventually produce mammals, lived in burrows along the river systems and waited out the harsher dry seasons. The skies above were quieter than they had been in tens of millions of years. The great Permian insects and the smaller forms with them had taken substantial losses. The forests were gone in the high latitudes and thinned everywhere else. The rivers ran differently, the soils held differently, The whole basin had become a different kind of place, supporting a different and much sparser fauna, in air that was warmer and drier than the late Permian Karoo had ever been. From the perspective of any individual animal living in it, the world was simply the world. From the perspective of the rocks, it was the post-extinction recovery world, and it would not look like the late Permian again for tens of millions of years to come. The animals that walked across it were our ancestors' siblings, the cousins of the cynodont lineage that had survived the boundary, the relatives of the small mammal line forms that would, across the next 200 million years, slowly assemble into the lineages that produced us. What they had come through was not over. The early Triassic would test them again, but they had come through, and what they brought with them into the world that lay on the far side of the closing event was the deep beginning of something it would take an extraordinary amount of patience to call our own. Lystrosaurus did not survive the Great Dying. It was already winning before it began. This is the part of the story where the older textbook framing tends to break apart, and the actual rocks tell a more interesting tale than the one we have been telling about them. The popular image of mass extinction survivors is of opportunists, animals that happened to be in the right place when everyone else died, that bloomed across the empty landscape, that filled the vacant niches with the indiscriminate energy of a species inheriting a world it had not earned. The image is satisfying. It is also, in the specific case of the late Permian survivors, almost completely wrong. The animals that walked through the closing event were not lottery winners. They were, in many cases, lineages that had been quietly preparing for the conditions the closing event was about to produce for hundreds of thousands of years before the catastrophe itself arrived. Lystrosaurus is the clearest case because the Karoo record preserves its rise in unusual detail. The genus appears in the southern African rocks as a minor presence in the Daptocephalus assemblage zone, the late Permian fauna dominated by larger dicynodonts. Across the closing few 100,000 years of the period, while the larger members of its own family were declining, Lystrosaurus was steadily becoming more abundant. Its body size was small to medium by Therapsid standards, adults reaching perhaps 1 meter to 1.5 meters in length, weighing in the range of a medium dog to a small pig. It was a burrower. The skeletal evidence, particularly the broad limbs and the powerful shoulder girdle, suggests that Lystrosaurus dug deep enough to escape the worst of the seasonal extremes that were sharpening across the late Permian Karoo. Its diet was tolerant. It could process tough, low-nutrient vegetation that more specialized herbivores could not, and its life history appears to have been faster than that of the larger dicynodonts, which means the population could rebound more quickly from local stresses. By the time the closing event arrived in the high latitudes, Lystrosaurus was already a substantial presence in the regional fauna. After the event, when the larger animals were gone, it was simply what was left. The structural pattern of survival across the boundary, when you sit back and look at it, applies more broadly than to Lystrosaurus alone. The lineages that came through were, with few exceptions, smaller-bodied than their late Permian relatives. They were more behaviorally flexible, burrowers, estivators, generalists. Their life histories tended toward faster reproduction and earlier maturity, which meant that even small surviving populations could rebuild rapidly when conditions briefly improved. They were, in many cases, animals that had been demographic minorities in the late Permian world, not the dominant forms, not the apex species, but the small dispersed populations operating in the ecological margins. The closing event did not select among equals. It selected against dominance. The animals that ruled the late Permian were the animals that had the most to lose, and in the event itself, they lost it. The animals that had been quietly persisting in the margins inherited what was left. Among those margin dwellers, the most consequential for our particular branch of the story were the cynodonts. The cynodonts were a group of advanced therapsids that had emerged in the late Permian after the Capitanian extinction had reorganized the synapsid fauna, and they were never numerically dominant in the late Permian world. The fossil record preserves them in modest numbers. They were small, most of them no larger than a modern terrier, and they appear to have lived primarily in burrows, hunting small prey, processing vegetation with teeth that were already showing the differentiated patterns that would become characteristic of mammals proper. They were not, in the late Permian Karoo, the animals you would have noticed first. The gorgonopsids hunted at the water's edge. The dicynodonts grazed in herds. The Inostrancevia immigrants drank from the rivers in the lengthening dry seasons. The cynodonts went about their lives in the spaces between, in the kind of ecological obscurity that, in retrospect, is one of the more reliable predictors of long-term survival. A handful of cynodont lineages came through the closing event. Not many. The exact number is difficult to pin down because the boundary itself is preserved imperfectly in the terrestrial record, and because cynodont fossils from the immediate post-boundary interval are rare. But the lineages that survived radiated outward in the early and middle Triassic into a remarkable diversity of forms. Some became larger, some became more carnivorous, some retained the small burrowing habits of their Permian ancestors. Across the next 20 to 30 million years, they would diversify into a fauna of advanced cynodonts that included the direct ancestors of the first true mammals, the small, fur-bearing, warm-blooded animals that would appear in the late Triassic and would, across the entire age of dinosaurs that followed, persist as a quiet and largely nocturnal presence on the planet, waiting for their own much later moment. I want to be honest about the lineage continuity here, because the framing matters and the science has been refined considerably in the last few decades. The cynodonts that came through the Permian-Triassic boundary were not mammals. They were not, in any straightforward sense, our direct ancestors. They were the ancestors of our ancestors, the great-great-grandparents of mammals proper, which would not appear for another 20 million years. And the cynodonts that survived the boundary were themselves only a subset of the synapsid lineage. Most of their cousins did not make it. Theracephalians persisted briefly into the early Triassic and then dwindled. Dicynodonts survived in some numbers and produced some genuinely successful Triassic forms, including animals the size of small hippopotamuses, but the entire group eventually went extinct in the late Triassic, leaving no descendants. Lystrosaurus itself, the most famous of the immediate survivors, persisted through the early Triassic in considerable abundance and then disappeared from the record without leaving close descendants. The lineage that made it all the way to mammals and through mammals to us was a narrow thread within a broader survivor fauna, most of which eventually closed. What this means, when you trace the line carefully, is that the path from the late Permian to the present is not the path that most of the late Permian survivors took. It is the path that one particular subset of one particular cynodont group took against substantial odds across roughly 250 million years. The other survivor lineages that walked out of the closing event with our ancestors, the dicynodonts, the theracephalians, the parareptiles, the temnospondyle amphibians, eventually all died out. The cynodonts themselves nearly died out repeatedly across the Triassic and the Jurassic. The first true mammals, when they finally appeared, were small enough to fit in a human hand, and they remained small enough for the next 140 million years. The thread that runs from the Karoo of 252 million years ago to the listener of this sentence is not a confident one. It is the survival, by margins so narrow that they look in retrospect like miracles, of one lineage among many, through one extinction of several, across a span of geological time long enough to fit every story we have ever told within it. The marine survivors deserve a similar accounting because the framing applies just as well there. The brachiopods that had dominated late Paleozoic seafloors were largely gone after the closing event, reduced to a handful of lineages that would persist as a quiet minor presence in marine ecosystems forever afterward. The bivalves and the gastropods, which had been demographic minorities in the late Permian, expanded into the empty space and became the dominant shelled invertebrates of the modern world. Every clam, every snail, every mussel and oyster you have ever encountered is descended from this post-extinction expansion. The conodonts, those small eel-like creatures that had been ubiquitous in Paleozoic seas, persisted through the Triassic and then went extinct in their own quiet event at the Triassic-Jurassic boundary. The ammonoids, the tightly coiled, shelled cephalopods that had nearly gone extinct at the boundary, recovered from a small handful of survivor lineages and became one of the most successful marine animal groups of the Mesozoic before their own eventual extinction at the end of the Cretaceous. The marine world of the Triassic, like the terrestrial world, was assembled from the unlikely remainders. What I find most worth saying, looking back across the closing event from the safe distance of 252 million years, is that the recovery was not a return. The world that emerged on the far side of the boundary was not the late Permian world rebuilt with new participants. It was a different world, with different dominant forms, organized along different principles, supporting a fauna that bore only distant resemblance to what had come before. The Paleozoic marine fauna, the world of brachiopods and crinoids and tabulate corals and the great Permian reef communities, was over. The Mesozoic marine fauna, with its ammonoids and its bivalves and its eventual marine reptiles, was something genuinely new. The same was true on land. The Therapsid Empire of the late Permian gave way after a brief recovery interval to the rise of the archosaurs, the lineage that would produce the dinosaurs, the crocodiles and the birds, and that would dominate terrestrial ecosystems for the next 170 million years, with our cynodont cousins persisting in the margins throughout. The survivors of the closing event did not rebuild what had been lost. They built something else. What walked into the early Triassic was a smaller, sparser, harder world. It was also, in a way that is easy to miss, the world that produced everything that came after. The mammals you know are the descendants of cynodont lineages that came through the closing event by margins almost too narrow to measure. The flowering plants, the bony fish, the modern coral reefs, the insects pollinating the gardens you walk through, all of them are downstream of the recovery world. Even the dinosaurs, when they eventually rose to dominance, did so on a fauna that had been reorganized by the closing event of the Permian. There is no continuity backward across the boundary that does not pass through it. The world we inhabit is not a continuation of the late Permian. It is the descendant of what the late Permian survivors became. The animals at the edge of the water in the early Triassic Karoo did not know any of this. They drank from the thinned rivers, and they hunted in the open floodplains, and they slept in their burrows when the long dry seasons came, and they had no idea that the world they were inhabiting was the foundation of every world that would come after. They were simply alive in their own moment, doing what their lineages had been doing for tens of millions of years, eating, sleeping, raising their young, dying, leaving behind the bones we now find in stratigraphic layers that did not yet exist on the day they were buried. The continuity from those animals to us is real, but it is the kind of continuity that only becomes visible looking backward across distances of time that no single living thing has ever been able to perceive. They did the work without knowing it was work. They survived without knowing they were surviving. And what they passed forward into the long quiet of the Triassic and the deep arc of the Mesozoic and the eventual age of mammals is the lineage that is now reading these words. In the burrows along the rivers of the early Triassic, in the slow first centuries after the closing event, the cynodonts went on with their lives. They were small animals, mostly nocturnal, mostly hidden. They hunted insects in the soft hours before dawn, when the dry winds had dropped and the temperature in the open air was tolerable for an animal whose metabolism was not yet fully its own. They retreated to their burrows during the harder parts of the day. They raised their young in chambers dug into the riverbank. They slept curled in the shapes that mammals still curl into, 252 million years before there was a mammal to make a habit of it. They did not know they were the beginning of anything. They did what their ancestors had done. The sun rose. The sun set. The world went on, in a thinned and altered form that none of them had any frame of reference to recognize as thinned, because they had never known the world that had come before. What was missing from that early Triassic world is, by any honest accounting, almost everything. The great Permian forests of the south were gone. The dinocephalian herds that had walked across the middle Permian floodplains were gone. The gorgonopsids that had hunted at the water's edge in the Karoo afternoons were gone. The trilobites, after 300 million years of marine residency, were gone. The fusulinid foraminifera that had built reefs across the warm, shallow seas of the entire Permian Period were gone. The rugose corals were gone. Whole classes, whole orders, whole branches of the tree of life had simply closed. The biosphere that had run for the previous 47 million years, in all its dinocephalian and gorgonopsid and Glossopteris-flavored particularity, was over. What replaced it would eventually become the world we live in. But it would take a long time, and the road to here would pass through dimensions of recovery and disturbance and quiet diversification that none of the survivors of the closing event could have anticipated. The biggest unanswered question about the closing event itself is not, strictly speaking, scientific. It is not what killed the late Permian biosphere. We have a reasonable picture of that, even if the details remain contested. It is not how long the killing took. Bowring and Burgess and their colleagues have given us numbers tighter than the entire span of human history. It is not how complete the killing was. Stanley and others have given us magnitudes refined to within a few percentage points. The question that remains genuinely open is one the rocks may never be able to answer. Why this one? Other large igneous provinces have erupted across the Phanerozoic. The Deccan traps at the close of the Cretaceous may have contributed to the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs. The Central Atlantic magmatic province at the end of the Triassic contributed to a substantial extinction of its own. The Vili traps, the Karoo basaltic eruptions of the Jurassic, the Columbia River basalts of the Miocene, large igneous province eruptions are not rare on geological timescales. Most of them coincide with biotic crises of various magnitudes. None of them produced anything like the closing event of the Permian. What was different about the late Permian remains, after all the work, partly a mystery. Some combination of factors, peculiar to that particular interval of Earth history, allowed the Siberian traps to do what no other large igneous province has done before or since. The carbon-rich sedimentary basins the magma intruded through. The pre-existing warming the system had already absorbed before the main pulse arrived. The pre-existing vulnerability of the marine fauna after the Capitanian extinction had thinned them 8 million years earlier. The particular configuration of Pangaea, which constrained ocean circulation in ways that may have made the planet more sensitive to atmospheric changes. The particular composition of the late Permian biosphere itself, which included a number of clades that turned out to be especially vulnerable to the specific stresses that arrived. We can list the contributing factors. We cannot, with full confidence, weight them. The closing event of the Permian is a single experiment that the planet ran once and for which we have only the after image to reconstruct. there are not enough comparable cases to test the hypotheses against. We are working even now with what one extinction told us, and one is a small sample size for a science that prefers larger. What is striking when you sit with this is that the lack of full understanding does not undo what we do know. We know the timing, we know the magnitude, we know the upstream cause, we know the broad patterns of who died and who came through. We know the geographic distribution of the casualties. We know enough to recognize the closing event as an event, to place it in its position in Earth history, to draw conclusions from it about the nature of mass extinction and the ways biospheres reorganize themselves under stress. The remaining mystery is not a failure, it is a horizon. Sciences that have answered all their questions are sciences that have stopped working. The Permian, even after 180 years of study since Murchison stood above the Kliasma River in 1841 and noticed the layers he could not name, is still asking us to look more carefully. It is still teaching us, generation by generation, what our planet has been capable of doing. The textbook in 20 years will be substantially different from the textbook we have now. This is what good science looks like when it works. Step back from the closing event for a moment and back from the Permian itself and look at the larger shape of what we have walked through. The Permian period ran for 47 million years. The dinosaurs ruled the Earth for about 170. They have been gone for 66. The first true mammals appeared roughly 25 million years after the closing event of the Permian, and persisted for approximately 140 million years as small nocturnal creatures in the shadow of the dinosaurs. The first primates appeared approximately 50 million years ago. The first hominins approximately 7 million years ago. The species Homo sapiens approximately 300,000 years ago. The earliest written record of a human civilization approximately 5,000 years ago. The lifetime of the listener of this sentence, however many decades it has so far run, occupies a fraction of all of those numbers, small enough that the mathematics required to express it cleanly is the kind of mathematics human bodies were not built to find intuitive. We are very brief. The Permian was very long. And the lineage that produced us, the synodont thread that came through the boundary in those early Triassic burrows, has been continuous from then to now without a single break. The night sky above the late Permian was not the night sky we know. The Earth was in a different position relative to the galactic center. The Sun and its planets have made roughly one full revolution around the Milky Way's center since the closing event of the Permian. One galactic year, give or take. The constellations the Gorgonopsids did not look at, because Gorgonopsids did not look at constellations, were nonetheless different from the ones we trace tonight. The stars that lit the late Permian dust when there was any moonlight are stars whose positions have drifted across the intervening galactic year by significant fractions of the sky. The Earth has carried its life, including the lineage that became us, through a single full circuit of the galaxy since the world we have just been visiting was alive. That is the scale on which the closing event of the Permian sits. It is not the scale on which we live. It is, however, the scale on which we exist, quietly, uncountably small, against a duration that the planet has been holding patiently in its rocks for our benefit, without ever asking us to. I want to say something now that I do not say often because the channel's voice is built to leave space for the listener to make their own meaning, and because I genuinely believe that the Permian is large enough to mean different things to different people. But I have spent some time with this material, and I want to share what it has come to mean to me in case it is useful. The Permian, when I sit with it, does not feel like a chapter of fear, it feels like a chapter of ancestry. The animals that walked through the closing event were not aware that they were doing anything special. They were simply alive in their moment, doing what their bodies and their lineages allowed. and the line they handed forward, generation by generation, across 252 million years and one full galactic revolution and roughly 10,000 mass extinction events of smaller magnitude that have not made it into any of our textbooks, that line eventually reached us. We are the recipients of a transfer that none of the participants knew was happening. The closing event of the Permian is not a story about dying. It is a story about what survives when almost everything else does not, and how surprisingly small and quiet the things that survive tend to be. The cynodonts in their burrows along the early Triassic riverbanks, the small dispersed populations of marginal animals doing their unremarkable work in the dust of a thinned world, are the reason there is anyone here to wonder about them. They did not know they were a doorway. We are the room they led to. What I take from the Permian, in the end, is something close to a settling of the shoulders. The world has been through this kind of thing before. The world has been through worse. The Earth's long memory is not a story of unbroken progress, and it is not a story of repeated catastrophe. It is a story of a planet that has been in motion for 4.5 billion years, that has supported life for at least 3.5 billion of them, that has gone through periods of extraordinary flourishing and periods of extraordinary loss, and that has, every time, produced what came next out of what came through. We are inside one of those periods now, on the crest of one of those long histories, in the company of a planet whose patience is older than anything we are capable of imagining. The cynodonts did not know what they were doing. We do not know what we are doing, but the planet has been here before, and what it asks of us, when we look at the rocks honestly, is not panic. It is recognition. The closing event of the Permian was real. The recovery was real. Both are part of the same story, and the story has not stopped. The night, where you are, is doing what nights have done for as long as there have been nights, slowing the air, dimming the colors, letting the world settle. Somewhere on the surface of the planet you are lying on, in a basin you may not have heard of, in rocks that you will probably never see. The bones of a small Permian Therapsid are sitting in stone that was floodplain mud 255 million years ago. The animal whose bones they are did not survive the closing event. Most of its relatives did not survive either. A few did, and the line ran from them through tens of millions of years of small obscure animals living under the rule of dinosaurs, through the rise of true mammals, through the long quiet of the Mesozoic, through the recovery after the next great closing event, through the assembly of primates and the slow lifting of one of those primate lineages onto two legs, through the development of language and agriculture and writing and photography and electrical light, until it reached the room you are in now. That is the lineage. That is the inheritance. The Permian is part of it. Not because we are descended from gorgonopsids or dicynodonts or Inostrancevia at the water's edge. We are not. They were our cousins, 25 times removed, and they died. We are descended from a quieter, smaller, more obscure lineage of animals whose names are not famous and whose bones are not on display. They survived the closing event, and the world they walked into was a world that, eventually, became this one. The Permian's role in our story is not as our origin. It is as the floor we are standing on. The deep time it occupies is the deep time we exist within, and the closing event it contains is the kind of event that the Earth keeps quiet records of, to be read by the patient when they are ready. It is late, where you are. The Permian is not going anywhere. It has been waiting 252 million years for us to learn to read it, and it will wait 252 million more if it needs to, for whoever comes after us. The rocks do not hurry, neither does anything they remember, and the lineage that walked through the closing event in those small early Triassic burrows is, somewhere in the dark, still walking, still doing the unhurried work of being alive in its moment, the way every generation of every species in the chain has done, all the way back through the boundary to the Karoo afternoon, when an Inostrancevia drank from a thinning river and did not know it was the end of anything. Sleep gently. The Permian held its world for 47 million years. The Earth has held you for as long as you have been here. Both of those durations are real. Both of them are quiet. Both of them are enough.